Hello, everybody. You are listening to Through Time and Clades. My name is Albert,
And I'm Joan.
and we are back doing another news episode for Through Time and Clades. But I guess before we get started, how have you been doing?
I've been doing pretty well. It's just busy. Work's been okay, and just kind of keeping up with family and friends, and maintaining that work-life balance, and keeping my sanity at the same time. But I mean, all kinds of exciting things are approaching, and I don't know if we are ready to talk about it yet. But I just kind of been preparing for big plans in the coming months, and it's like that excitement of anticipation as it gets closer and closer and closer, and it seems less far away than it did like the previous week. Um, and I just we'll have a lot to talk about for sure in future episodes. Um, but yeah, so far not too bad on my end. How about you?
Oh yeah. I guess since we last recorded, a number of things have happened. First of all, is like at the end of July to beginning of August, they're about, or first half of August, I suppose. I took a trip to Taiwan to see my family. It's been a little while since I've been to see them, so I decided to use the summer as an opportunity to do so. And I will say, if any of you listening out there are interested in visiting Taiwan, it is a lovely place to visit. But you probably shouldn't do it in northern hemisphere summer. Um, that is when the weather gets very hot and humid. And furthermore, there's a chance of typhoons at this time of the year, which I actually encountered while I was there. Now I was actually pretty lucky because the typhoon arrived like on the night that my plane landed. So if my plane had been just a few hours later, it probably would have been canceled completely. But it was able to land before the typhoon did, and so I was able to get there just fine. I did have to stay home the next few days because it's not safe to go out when there's a typhoon out there. But fortunately, it did not like disrupt my travel plans, and I had a good time. Got to see a lot of different birds there, even though it's not the optimal time to be outdoors in Taiwan during the summer. There are still quite a number of interesting bird species out and about. I think I saw around 40 species. There were a few of them that I actually hadn't seen before. So yeah, what we in the birding world call lifers, like birds that you see in the wild for the first time. I got to see this year's Doraemon movie, which I've been looking forward to, and it's a really
Ooh.
nice one. I think this one is not so much about natural history. The main theme is music, but I would rank it pretty high among the Doraemon movies. It's probably in my top 15 or so. And if you think that doesn't sound very high, remember that there are over 40 Doraemon movies. So that's there are quite a lot of them to rank. Um, and otherwise, since I've come back, I've been back in the UK for a number of weeks. I've gone back to work, making progress on my research projects, and that's going relatively well. And I have a project that's really wrapping up now. And actually, speaking of research projects, while I was gone, a new paper that I co-authored came out. Um, so this paper, I'm not the first author on. It's mostly the work of Abby Crane, who was a master's student when she did this work here in Cambridge. She is now a PhD student at the University of Southampton. But while she was here, she did a lot of work looking at the lower jaw anatomy of birds. Specifically, she was focusing on the jaw anatomy of Asteriornis, or aka the wonder chicken, which is one of the oldest known modern birds and a species that I helped name along with my colleagues back in 2020. And the reason that we're really interested in the lower jaw anatomy of this animal is that we think it is closely related to the lineage that includes both the chickens and the ducks, or chicken-like birds and duck-like birds. And these two groups of birds today look very different, but as you would probably know if you have checked out our series Dinosaur was the second chapter, their lower jaw anatomy actually has some pretty noteworthy similarities. And so if you want to know whether or not Asteriornis is a member of this group, then studying its jaw anatomy would give us an idea. And if it is a member of this group, then it probably actually shows us what like the early members of the group look like in terms of their jaws. And what she found was that it turns out that we had to update our understanding of the jaw anatomy of Asteriornis a little bit because some of the stuff that we wrote in the original description, it turns out, was incorrect. And so, yeah, we had to like update the record on that. So that's how science works, right? Like you discover new things and you update your knowledge depending on what you find. Um, and nonetheless, even though the interpretation of some of the jaw anatomy has changed, we found that the best supported evolutionary position for Asteriornis is still as an early member of this duck and chicken group, Galoancerae. And so that still seems to be very well supported. And in fact, if you look at the jaw anatomy, like what is there, it still looks like way more like Galoancerae than any other kind of bird. Um, yeah, we are still pretty confident that at least those of us who were on the original Asteriornis description, we're still pretty confident that Asteriornis is a member of this major lineage. So yeah, I'll definitely put a link to that paper in the description below. It is open access, so anyone can check it out. And yeah, I think those are my main updates, quite a few for the time being, at least those that I can talk about. Today's news episode is going to be kind of interesting. We're going to shake things up a little, right? Because it turns out that really about only half of this episode is like a standard news episode. So we have each chosen only one story from the past month to discuss. And then after that, we're going to do a little mini review of the short film Prehistoric Beast by Phil Tippett, as well as the dinosaur sequences in the 1980s documentary Dinosaur with an exclamation mark, which Phil Tippett also worked on. So that was Joan's idea to kind of include as part of this episode. So I'll let her talk about the motivations for doing so. But we do have a few other like general pop culture updates we want to discuss. So I guess if you don't have anything more to add to the intro, feel free to take us to that.
Absolutely. Yeah, we'll jump to the next slide. You know, we try to do our best to kind of keep our audience up to date on like what kind of new documentary series to look forward to that pertain to natural history topics, as is the course of our show. And upon our our searches, we were made aware of a number of really exciting productions coming from the BBC Studios Natural History Unit. And so we're going to talk about a little bit of those today, what we know and what we can anticipate for these sorts of things. So first things first, we have the announcement of Asia. This is to be a 7-episode series. According to the press release, it, quote, tells the story of the biggest continent on Earth through its epic landscapes and spectacular wildlife. Um, and upon hearing about this, like our minds immediately went to 2013's Africa, which was another documentary series by the BBC Natural History Unit that essentially provided a really beautiful portrait of African wildlife and really stood out among the BBC series in focusing more on species and behaviors that are little known or little shown in these sorts of documentaries. You would think like a documentary series about African wildlife would dominate, with the Serengeti or maybe some of the
Mhm,
Congolese species like mountain gorillas and elephants. Um, but no, it spends a lot of time talking about like Saharan wildlife
mhm,
and wildlife of South Africa, the different plant species, the coastal species, um, and focuses a lot on like invertebrates and reptiles, not just big mammals. Um, and it's really one of the better series that they've done in recent years. And so to see them announce Asia, it really kind of brings into our minds that like this is probably going to be like the equivalent to that. We're probably going to get some really amazing and unfamiliar species and environments covered in the series for a change. And given that it is 7 episodes versus Africa, which was 5, including a conservation finale, there's going to be even more to look forward to. Um, I know from the press releases, they have teased that some of the spotlights are going to include the Arabian Desert, the Sulawesi rainforests, the Siberian tundra and taiga, and the coral reefs of the Indian Ocean. So it's really going to cover a lot of different habitats. And goodness knows what else they're hiding from us. Um, So this is going to be for BBC One and the iPlayer as well. And they've been consistently saying, like, the most recent press releases that we could find, supposed to come out this year. But we haven't really seen anything yet. So I have a hunch that we might get surprised with a trailer or a teaser, in today's parlance, for this thing very soon, which I'm sure we will cover as soon as we can. Um, I'm definitely excited for this one. How about you?
Oh yeah, I like Africa, the BBC nature documentary series is one of my favorite series that they have done for pretty much the reasons you mentioned. And so, if this series on Asia turns out to be anything like that, I think it'll be another winner for sure. So yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to this one, and I'm really curious to see if it's actually going to release this year. And yeah, like the last time we discussed like BBC recent nature documentary productions, I talked a little bit about how I was feeling a bit of what I was calling documentary fatigue, um, and how a lot of the recent titles seem to feel kind of samey to me. But with this one, I'm actually pretty intrigued. Like I feel like this one definitely has potential to be something different. So yeah, I am very interested to see what they have in store for this one, as well as the next one that you're about to talk about too.
Oh yeah. So the second one that we wanted to highlight is Hidden Planet. Now, I don't know about y'all, but it seems like maybe the BBC had kind of read our minds when we last talked about BBC series and how, like, we're kind of interested in seeing, the little guys, the insects and microinvertebrates in the soil, and having a documentary series about them. And lo and behold, Hidden Planet is set to be something of that vein. So it's a 5 episode series. According to the press release, and I quote, Hidden Planet will dive into the secret world of the most successful and important animals on Earth, insects, building on the remarkable advances in camera technology pioneered by the Green Planet, which is also excellent. The series reveals the beautiful and dramatic lives of insects in unprecedented detail. And I mean, yeah, like having seen the Green Planet and like their micro photography and time lapse footage, I can only imagine what they have in store for us with insects. And they're mentioning insects. I'm sure they'll probably include like spiders and earthworms and snails and other microinvertebrates. That I would be surprised if they didn't, but I guess we will see how that goes. Um, from the press releases, we know that we're going to get a lot of coverage on different behaviors. So parental care, insect architecture, nest building, communication, as well as ecological roles in both natural and human habitats, which that'll certainly be interesting to see. Um, in many ways, this could be seen as a spiritual successor to David Attenborough's 2005 Life in the Undergrowth, which was part of his Big Life series. Um, and I mean, that was also 5 episodes, if I remember
I think so.
correctly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it covered a wide range of microinvertebrates and just for the time had really amazing photography. And so, like, given what we have now with these advancements, I'm sure this is going to be even more spectacular, and hopefully we'll cover even more unique and unfamiliar insects and their kind, than previous series have done. I mean, just to have them have the focus to start with is pretty exciting in its own right. So this is also for BBC One and the iPlayer. We do not have a release date for this, and in fact, we have no confirmation as to whether David Attenborough is going to return to be the narrator slash host. Of course, nor do we know that for Asia as well. They've kept that in the dark. I know for many recent series that are not exclusive to the BBC, they have gone with like other celebrities or narrators to cover these shows. I know they basically have like an American series on the Americas, narrated by Tom Hanks. So whether they will, grab another celebrity to do these, or whether Attenborough's already been attached and has been following these with anticipation, we will see. But I'm certainly really excited to get some, insect treatment for a change by the BBC. How about you?
Yes, I definitely agree. I mean, we've already talked about how underrepresented insects and other invertebrates tend to be in nature documentaries, and yeah, so to hear them do another big budget production like focusing on them, that's very very welcome. And it is kind of funny that in the press release they this time they mentioned that insects are the most successful animals ever because as you might recall, like when we talked about mammals, we kind of made fun of the fact that in that press release, they were like, mammal was the most successful group of animals ever. And we're like, huh? By what standard, right? And, well, I mean, yeah, I guess that is the thing. It's like, by what standard are you measuring these things when you say something is the most successful group of what their animal or other organism ever? And it can always be argued that the whatever bigger clade includes that group is more successful, right? Right? Because you could say that well, insects are the most successful group ever, but what about crustaceans, which include insects? And if that surprises you, you have to listen to more of our show. Why don't we say that crustaceans are the most successful group ever? Because they include insects and a bunch of other things too. So it's, yeah, it's one of those pitfalls that we tend to fall into when we discuss biodiversity, I think. But nonetheless, I do think it's good that the insects are getting their due, and certainly in terms of the number of species that they represent on Earth, then certainly they represent like the majority of animal life. And in that sense, you could say that most animals are insects, which is kind of kind of mind blowing to think about. Um, and so, yes, I'm definitely looking forward to this one too. It definitely seems pretty promising, and I'm very interested to see what they come up with. It's kind of nice that they're doing these kinds of spiritual successors to their previous classic series. We already mentioned before how Green Planet felt like an update of, or at least a spiritual successor to David Attenborough's Private Life of Plants, and I liked Green Planet a lot. So I think this one sounds like it should be a pretty interesting and impressive production as well. And I see you have one more entry on here. Why did you tell us about that?
Yeah, so this third one that we wanted to highlight is called very simply Home. Now, this is to be apparently a 9-season series that is going to be filmed and released over a decade.
Oh my goodness.
Has been, yeah, hailed as, and I quote from the press release, the most ambitious and definitive portrait of life on Earth ever attempted. A journey across 5 oceans and 7 continents to reveal the deeply symbiotic relationships between all living things, which sets a, quote, new benchmark for landmark natural history television. So there's very little information on this, and that leaves a lot of room for speculation.
Mm-hmm.
Um, to dedicate 9 seasons over a decade, with how many ever episodes are with each season, on BBC Natural History Unit quality footage is a really tall order and is
Mm-hmm.
really exciting to think
Yeah.
about. Um, Especially when you hail it as like a definitive portrait of life on Earth. Is this going to be a proper successor to Attenborough's Life on Earth? Are we going to get to see like representatives of every group of organism throughout this series over its 9-season run? Um, I don't know. And I mean, new benchmarks. That's I mean, goodness knows, like with camera technology and travel and the things that we've been able to see on these recent documentaries. Like, how much better can you get
Mm.
on this sort of coverage? I don't know, and I'm very curious about it. That said, uh, this is going to be a Disney Plus exclusive series, as I understand it, on their National Geographic, tab. Um, so I guess you can only watch it there. Which, I mean, obviously, given recent events, I don't know how many people are going to have Disney Plus anymore. Don't blame them.
Yep.
So I don't know if they're going to eventually like put this on DVD or on the National Geographic channel itself. I don't know. Um, Also unsure if David Attenborough is even going to be attached to this. Not saying anything's written in stone, but I think giving Attenborough another decade for documentaries is a pretty tall order. Um, but I mean, I'm definitely curious to see how this is going to be and what kind of tone and format it's going to be.
Mm.
How didactic it's going to be versus you know um, spectacle.
Mm,
which we've talked about before on the show, our pros and cons to those approaches. Um, but it certainly seems like we got, you know, between these three series and many more that they've announced, there's lots of short films and series about like individual animals like orcas and lions that are also working on. Um, we got a lot to look forward to from the BBC, and I can't wait to see what we're going to have.
mm,
Do you have any closing
mm.
thoughts on these, buddy?
Oh, no, except to say that they definitely intrigue me, and I am excited to see what they're like. And yeah, with home, obviously we don't have a lot of info about it just yet, but just the very idea of this like long running what was it, like 9 season series, doing this with a nature documentary. Wow, that feels very surreal, and I like you, I'm definitely very um kind of curious as to see how exactly they structure this and how they pull it off. um yeah, but no, I don't think I have any other major things to add. So if we want to get into your first story, you're very much welcome to do so.
Absolutely. Yeah, so we'll jump in. So we'll talk about each of our news stories and then get into our review. So I got first dibs on the slide here. So mollusks belong to one of the largest clades of invertebrate animals, known as Lophotrachozoa, which houses something like over 143,000 species, the majority of which, are mollusks. Um, and this group in particular are close relatives of the Lophophorates, the brachiopods and bryozoans, which we discussed relatively recently during our 2023 Roundup episode, as well as the annelid or segmented worms, which include the earthworms and leeches, as well as many aquatic forms known as polychaetes. These animals are united by genetic features, as well as the fact that some members possess lophophores, the filter feeding tentacles, while others possess trachophore larvae, which is a free swimming ciliated form, hence the name Lophotrachozoa. Now, historically, the arrangement of this group and even the inclusion of certain lineages has been a bit contentious, but for now, researchers generally agree that the presence or absence of a lophophore or trachophore condition does not necessarily dictate close relations, like between members. So, like, not necessarily all the lophophore groups are going to be closely related. Not necessarily all the trachophore larval forms are going to be closely related. Regardless of that discourse, it's generally accepted at least that mollusks, annelids, and lophophorates are close relatives. And this is important in understanding the evolution of the mollusks themselves. So, annelids and lophophorates, and by that I mean brachiopods in their larval form, as well as their immediate ancestors in the fossil record, possess chaetae, which is a bristly covering made of chitin, which surrounds the body of the animal and can be used for anything from locomotion to defense against predators. Mollusks, meanwhile, lack chaetae and are instead covered by tough biomineralized structures. These can either be the full shell itself, as seen in the conchiferan mollusks, so that's the clams, snails, nautiloids, and kin, or as layers of plated shells called sclerites, as seen in the aculiferan mollusks, like the chitins. Given their close relationship and the fact that mollusks and brachiopods independently evolved shells, it has been a long-standing question of how the shells of both mollusk lineages emerged in the first place. We have examples of several stem mollusks, both outside the crown group and within both Conchifera and Aculeifera, that have provided some clues in the past. The famous early to middle Cambrian Wiwaxia, which is only about 5 centimeters long and looked like a stereotypical Viking helmet crossed with a thagomizer, seems to be a very early mollusk based on recent studies, not a worm necessarily. And it has sclerites like modern chitins. The Middle Cambrian Odontogryphus, in contrast, lacks full sclerites, but may have possessed a sort of reduced sclerite on its back. So, moving within the crown group mollusca, we find forms like Calvopillosa and Halkieria that seem to have been on the stem leading to the living aculiferans, and they possessed ancestral sclerites too. While the question of whether the sclerite condition was ancestral to the shell condition in conchiferans remains unanswered. But it is thanks to Guanshu Zhang and colleagues for describing a new Cambrian form that we may just have just the sort of transitional form needed to elucidate the origin of mollusk sclerites and possibly shells too. I'd like you all to meet Shishania aculeata from the Middle Cambrian period of 415 to 409 million years ago. That's specifically Series 2, Stage 4, as per the conventional geologic terminology. It was discovered within the Wulongqing Formation of Yunnan Province in China and are known from several complete remains. It lacks a full shell, like conchiferan mollusks, and is instead covered in sclerites, like an aculeatherid, which provides a nice conical armor around the body, which possessed the muscular foot and mantle cavity that is definitive of both stem and crown mollusks. And if the restoration on the left is anything to go by, Shishania would have creeped and flexed slowly along the sea floor like a modern chitin, grazing on algae and small animals like barnacles that glue themselves to the rocks. Um, but it is the sclerites that are especially fascinating in this animal. They appear to be hollow in form, though likely filled with tissues and life, and are unmineralized, unlike living chitins. They are instead chitinous, and when examined closely at the microscopic level, show a series of tubular canals, like a honeycomb, that are also characteristic of the chaetae seen in larval brachiopods and annelid worms. We know from genetic and embryological studies that the chaetae of worms and lophophorates shares a common ancestry, a same genetic basis. And we know from the phylogenetic analysis in this paper that Shishania is grouped as a stem mollusk at the base of the two crown groups, as it shares morphological traits with both. Put all this together, that implies then that the sclerites of mollusks evolved from the chaetae of earlier ancestors that then became biomineralized. And Shishania provides a key look at how this transition may have occurred. And this is further supported by anatomical analyses of living mollusks like chitins, as well as the obscure worm-like aplacophorans, which respectively show evidence of a chitinous envelope around their biomineralized plates and small chitinous hairs along the body. Still, two possibilities remain for elaborating this model, given the varied anatomical nature of stem mollusks. Either the transition happened only once in mollusk evolution, which implies then that conchiferans evolved from a aculeatheran-like ancestor, and this may even be suggested by an early Cambrian group called the Shachichids, who have merged their sclerites into a singular shell-like structure. Or alternatively, this transition happened multiple times in early mollusk evolution, first with forms like Wiwaxia and Shishania, and later with the true ancestors of the aculeatherids. Now, both are exciting hypotheses that could be further explored in new research, but nevertheless, the link between chaetae and sclerites and shells seems stronger than ever, and helps bridge these widely derived invertebrate lineages even closer together by a common ancestor that may then have been a worm-like organism covered in bristly chaetae. It's just time will tell if we find an organism like this in the earliest Cambrian or beyond. And so I thought it was neat to see, mollusk evolution further elaborated here and even tied in with other Lophotrochozoans to kind of elaborate this part of the animal family tree, which is why I wanted to feature this paper today. Do you have any thoughts, Albert?
Yeah, I mean, it is always cool to see more, direct information about the origins of major animal groups. And yeah, this is quite a remarkable find for sure. I think with mollusks, the thing is, they tend to have a pretty good fossil record, right? Or at least the conchiferans do, because their skeleton is or at least it tends to be made up of a single uh, large shell, and that fossilizes pretty easily. And so we have a pretty good record of a lot of the major mollusk groups in the fossil record. But of course, like pretty much all animal life, they originally descended from soft-bodied ancestors, and so you want to trace this down to like their very beginnings. That becomes a lot harder because we just have less fossil evidence of the soft-bodied forms, and then you get the question of, okay, so when do you get a shell, and how do you get a shell out of a soft-bodied ancestor? And that can be tricky too, because as you can see here, and as you presented quite nicely, it seems that the earliest mollusks started out with not just like a single piece shell, but like with multiple sclerites covering their body. And these sclerites, when the animal dies, they tend to get scattered, and it can be very difficult for us to find good remains of these early, stem mollusks. But sometimes we get lucky, as in this case. And wow, like it's always amazing to see these fossil finds, where you find this one fossil, and like it gives you like so much insight into like the origins of a group, and it really highlights like the importance of the fossil record in helping us understand evolution. And of course, like we do have to be careful with these things, right? It's like these are yeah, single data points, or at least very very few data points. And obviously, if we did have like the complete family tree of these early mollusks, we might find some nuances in there that are slightly different to how things are being presented now. But of course, in science, we work with what we have, and I think this seems to like a very plausible model for how the mollusk shell could have evolved. I think like regardless of like the nuances, it does go to show that the fossil record is our only direct way of figuring out what the early members of these lineages look like, and what their morphology was like, what their structure was like, and to an extent, what their behavior and ecology was like. And so, if you really want to understand the origins of our modern biodiversity, if you really want to get a complete picture of that, it is very important to kind of get that data from the fossil record. So, yes, it's always wonderful to see finds like these.
Absolutely. And now I understand that you have an invertebrate paper yourself that you wanted to talk
Yeah,
about.
it is interesting how that worked out. So I guess we can move on to the next slide and talk about my story for this episode. And so, yes, we are going to talk about flatworms. Um, this is quite interesting because I sometimes I'm surprised by the diversity of topics we have talked about on the show. Because you might think that we probably never talked about flatworms before, but actually we have. We actually have done a flatworm story before. But I'll get to that in a bit because it is kind of related to the one I'm going to talk about today. Um, so, first of all, like, what are flatworms anyway? Well, as their name suggests, flatworms are a type of, well, worm, which is basically a general name for a soft bodied bilateral animal. And again, as their name suggests, their bodies tend to be very flat. So, this is a type of animal where it's like their name suggests exactly what they are. They're a type of flat worm. Phylogenetically, it turns out that flatworms are probably a member of a group of invertebrates called Spiralia. And this is actually kind of related to your story because it turns out that the Lophotrochozoans are also members of Spiralia. So essentially, the protostome invertebrates, the group in which the mouth appears first in embryonic development, can be divided into two major lineages, and one of these is the Ecdysozoa, so the molting protostomes, and that includes things like arthropods and their close relatives. And the other major group is Spiralia, and so that includes Lophotrochozoans and flatworms, among many other things. And the internal relationships of Spiralia, it turns out, are a bit of a mess right now. Like almost every study finds something different. So yeah, it's one of the big problems in animal phylogeny that we still have is what is the internal relationships of Spiralia. But nonetheless, we are pretty confident that flatworms and Lophotrochozoans, including mollusks and annelids and all those other groups that you just mentioned, are like close relatives to each other. Um, and in case you're not aware, we are not protostomes, so we are more distantly related from all of these animals compared to how they are to each other. Um, so we belong to like the other major group of bilateral animals, the deuterostomes, the ones where the anus develops first. That being said, there's a bit of controversy there too. In recent years, some genetic studies recently have found a different arrangement of the bilateral animal groups, but we don't have to go into that right now. Traditionally, we are divided into hydrostomes, protostomes. Today, both of our stories are about protostomes, and both of our stories are about spiralian protostomes. When it comes to the general kind of body plan of flatworms, they're relatively simple as bilateral animals go. So, unlike us, for example, they don't have a body cavity where the internal organs fit into. In fact, they don't have any specialized respiratory or so breathing or circulatory organs at all. And this actually explains why they come in this kind of flat body shape, because it turns out that they basically have to absorb all the oxygen that they need from the outside of their body instead of using some kind of breathing organ like gills or lungs to do it. And so that's the reason they have to be really flat and thin, and so that they can get enough oxygen to all the parts of the body that they need. And because they have such a simple body shape, it is tempting to suggest that flatworms are a quote unquote kind of primitive group of bilateral animals. But of course, we know from genetic studies nowadays that that is not true. So they are in fact closely related to like quote unquote more complex things like mollusks and annelids, and to an extent arthropods as well. And so probably they evolved from ancestors that had like a body cavity and then became more simplified. But it seems to have worked out pretty well for them because there are many species of flatworms, like dozens of thousands of species. Now, in terms of how they live, flatworms are mostly aquatic. They tend to be found in aquatic environments. They can be found in both marine and freshwater environments. As well as some types of moist terrestrial environments. But because of their flat bodies and lack of specialized respiratory organs, they do have to stay in places where it's wet and where it's easier for them to, keep moist and be able to absorb oxygen through the outer surface of their bodies. Some flatworms are free-living predators mostly, so they hunt other organisms that are around their body size. And in fact, some of the marine flatworms are quite astonishing to look at. They come in these very striking color patterns and are quite beautiful, to be honest. And I don't just mean in the way that you're a natural history enthusiast, so of course you think like all animals are beautiful. But no, like a lot of these flatworms that come up, like these marine flatworms, they come in these amazing colors. Like they are beautiful by just about anybody's standards, I would think. And they swim in the most amazing way too. So they're able to like ripple the sides of their bodies to swim through the water, and it's a quite a mesmerizing sight, really. So if you've never seen videos of these marine flatworms, you should definitely look them up. However, the majority of flatworm species are not free living species, so they don't go out and hunt for individual prey items. Instead, the majority of flatworm species, the way that they live is as parasites. So that is quite interesting. So they either live on or inside the bodies of other animals. And it turns out that this type of lifestyle where they live inside the bodies of other animals has evolved multiple times in flatworms. Now, probably a group that most people will have at least heard about are the tapeworms. So that's one group of parasitic, in fact, internal parasitic flatworms. The technical term is endoparasitic. And so, yeah, if you're not familiar with flatworms before, then you've probably at least heard of tapeworms, of which are some species that can infect humans. A different group of endoparasitic flatworms are the trematodes or flukes, and they are the subject of the story we're going to talk about today. And the trematodes are very interesting because they tend to have a very complex life cycle, and there are tens of thousands of species of trematodes. So, of course, this is not going to be a one-size-fits-all description, but a fairly typical life cycle for a trematode or a fluke is basically a case where their eggs are shed from the droppings of their hosts, so the animal that they live inside. And so the droppings get fed on, or the eggs get fed on by another animal. In many cases, a mollusk, so a snail, for example. And so the snail ends up eating these trematode eggs, and they hatch inside the snail. And inside the snail, they can undergo like a whole series of transformations. So it's not just they have like one type of larval stage. Like they can go through like multiple different larval stages inside this snail, depending on the species. But the key thing here is that while they're inside the snail, they undergo asexual reproduction. So basically, they produce offspring without mating. They just kind of produce like almost like clones of themselves inside the snail. And so their goal inside the snail is to feed and grow and then produce like new offspring. Um, but these new offspring, they're not going to look like the trematodes that were living inside the snail. Instead of a lot of the time, this second like generation of offspring, they are like capable of swimming through the water by themselves. Um, and what they'll do is that they'll leave the snail and then they go out in search of the next animal to infect. And the next animal they want to infect is often not a snail, but in many cases, a fish. So they will find a fish and they will enter its body. But the main goal, while they're inside the fish, is for the fish to get eaten by a third animal, in many cases a bird or a mammal. Um, and then what happens is that when the mammal or bird eats the fish, it then gets infected by the trematodes. And at this point, the trematodes have entered their adult form, their final form. And in the last host, this bird or mammal, they will undergo sexual reproduction. So they'll seek each other out and mate and produce eggs. And then eventually those eggs get shed inside the whole host's droppings, and the whole cycle starts all over again. So yeah, like how's that for a very weird life history? It's very complicated, but it certainly seems to work out for them because remember how many species of trematodes there are. Like for perspective's sake, like there are about 6,000 species of mammals and 11,000 species of birds. So trematodes alone, not just even all flatworms, trematodes alone match the number of species of birds that there are at least. It wouldn't surprise me if there were many more species that we just have not scientifically described yet. This particular story is going to be about a part of the trematode life cycle, specifically a species called Haplorchis pumilio. This study that this story is about concerns a very unusual finding regarding this species of trematode. So this species basically follows a general pattern that we described earlier. So they start out in a snail, and I think they go on to infect a fish, and then they end up inside a mammal or a bird. In fact, this is a species that can infect humans, so they are a health risk to us. The particular kind of life history stage that we're going to discuss in this story is when these trematodes are inside a snail. So, kind of after they have hatched from eggs and they're undergoing asexual reproduction inside this snail. This study concerns a fairly interesting finding. And so it has been found in previous studies that some types of trematodes, when they're inside their snail host, not all members of this trematode colony that kind of infect the snail end up looking the same. So some trematode flatworms produce these non-reproductive individuals that act as quote-unquote soldiers. And so these soldier flatworms, what they do is that they're meant to defend the host from any other trematodes that might want to infect them. And so the soldiers are responsible for like killing off competitors that might want to infect the host. And so the reproductive individuals in the colony can continue to feed off the host and eventually breed. However, what makes these soldier flatworms different from soldiers in other types of social animals, like many types of insects have soldiers, for example, like termites and some types of ants, is that it seems that these soldier flatworms eventually mature to become a reproductive individual. So they're kind of a phase that they go through. But eventually, if they survive for long enough, these soldiers stop being soldiers and kind of mature into reproductive individuals, which is not the case in soldier ants or soldier termites, where they just don't breed at all and are completely focused on defending the colony. However, in this new paper, the authors have reported a case where it seems like the flatworm Haplorchis pumilio does produce non-reproductive soldiers, and this sets it apart from other examples of flatworms that have this similar type of behavior. So how did they make this discovery? Well, what they did was that they looked at many, many colonies of these flatworms that were living inside snails, and what they found was that very consistently, they were able to distinguish between two different types of individual flatworms. And you can see them pictured on the right on the slide here. So in one form, there's a soldier form that is specialized for attacking and killing other flatworms. And then there's a reproductive form, which looks very different. And it turns out that even immature reproductive forms looked very different from the soldiers. It's not like the soldiers were the immature reproductives. No, Like there's a clearly distinguishable difference between the immature reproductives versus the soldiers, as well as with the mature reproductives as well. And so some of the major differences are that the soldiers lack reproductive organs. Now, even the immature reproductives, even though they are not ready to reproduce just yet, have like what they call a germinal mass that will kind of grow to become the reproductive organs. But you don't see this part in the soldiers. The soldiers also have a longer gut than the immature reproductives, and well, a bigger pharynx, or kind of like a throat region or mouth region of these flatworms. And the reason that they have this big pharynx is to attack and kill other flatworms. Basically, the authors did these experiments where they exposed these soldiers to other species of flatworms that might want to infect the same snail species, and the soldiers would always like go on the attack whenever these flatworms are around, and that's what this figure on the left is meant to show. So this larger flatworm is being attacked by these smaller Haplorchis pumilio soldiers, which are referred to by these dark triangular arrows. And so they use this pharynx to kind of penetrate the body of these flatworms, which eventually kills them. And they basically feast on the insides of their enemies. It is quite likely this is the reason why in the snails that these authors sampled, Haplorchis pumilio was by far the most common species, specifically in the species of snail that they were looking at. So these are red-ribbed Melania snails. This is quite interesting because first of all, the authors are doing this study in California, where both these snails and this Haplorchis pumilio flatworm are introduced species, so they're not native. So this is probably something that allows like this species of flatworm to be very competitive outside of its native range, and so they can be very successful in this like habitat that it is not native to. Um, Something else that's quite curious about uh, the behavior of this flatworm is that it turns out that even though the soldier flatworms attacked other species of flatworms very viciously, they never attacked members of their own species, even individuals from a different colony. And the authors don't really know why this is. One possibility is that it may be that at least in California, there isn't a lot of genetic variation in this species of flatworm. So basically, it might be that they just cannot tell apart whether or not an individual flatworm of their own species belongs to like the same colony as them or not. So they just ignore everybody basically in case they kill one of their own. So that might be a reason why. It's a pretty unusual pattern because otherwise, members of the same species are usually they pose like the most competition with each other compared to other species, right? If you're the exact same species, then you need pretty much the exact same resources to survive, and so your biggest competitors are going to be members of your own species, and yet they have like this adaptation to kind of fend off competitors, and yet they do not attack members of their own species. So yeah, it's quite interesting, and it'll take more research to figure out exactly why this is the case. But they do suggest like the kind of low genetic variation as a hypothetical like explanation. This is quite an unusual finding for a flatworm where you have like such a specialized soldier caste, as they're called, that they don't reproduce at all, and they don't even have the potential to reproduce into reproductive forms, as far as we can tell. And so, what might be promoting this kind of adaptation? Well, in insects, and so the other animals where we find this kind of adaptation, and where there's a sterile, like non-reproductive soldier caste, are in like as mentioned before, some types of social insects, and also a few species of social shrimp. The other types of animals that have this kind of adaptation usually adopt what is called like a factory fortress defense strategy. So they're basically playing, you can think of it as a tower defense game. So they have this colony set up, and in the case of insects, it's often like they have this nest, right? And they live inside this nest, and they store food inside this nest, and they raise their young, and they raise the next generation inside this nest. And so the key to their survival is to kind of defend the nest against potential predators and against potential competitors. And so this kind of life history behavior promotes the evolution of like this specialized soldier caste that is only responsible for defending the fortress, basically defending the castle, and not capable of reproduction themselves. And so it seems that these flatworms have hit upon very similar strategy. If you think of the host snail, as basically their fortress. So they are basically feeding on the snail and breeding inside the snail. And so they had to defend this snail, even though it is another living organism, against kind of potential competitors um, and even predators that might want to eat the snail or them. So it turns out that previous studies have shown that Haplorchis pumilio actually causes some changes to the snails that they infect. So they'll actually cause these snails to grow bigger than they normally would, and as well as grow thicker shells than they normally would. And probably this relates to them having to defend their host, basically. So they have to make the host better defended so it doesn't get eaten before they can finish their reproductive cycle, or at least their reproductive cycle that they do inside the snail before they leave the snail. So yeah, quite an interesting bit of natural history here. Parasites are always like very good for these natural history stories. Like yeah, like they can be kind of creepy, you know, but it's hard not to be fascinated by how complex their life cycles can be. Um, and I mentioned earlier that we have talked about flatworms before on the show, and in our most recent news roundup that we did for this year, one of the stories that we picked, in fact, one of the stories that you talked about was about flatworms and specifically about trematodes. And as it turns out, it was also about kind of cooperation among colonies of trematodes. In that case, it was not that some trematodes were acting as soldiers and defending the colony, but instead, it seems that some recent discovery found that some of these flatworm colonies have individuals that are specialized for swimming and others that aren't. And so what they're doing is that they're looking for the next host after they've left their mollusk host. So they're looking for like a fish host, for example. And the swimming individuals become responsible for kind of like propelling the colony through the water, even though they're probably not going to be the ones that end up breeding inside the next host. It turns out that it's the non-swimming individuals that seem to be adapted for reproduction. So yeah, that was a really unusual story too. And so we're finding more and more instances of kind of cooperation within these flatworm colonies. And so certainly that is quite a fascinating aspect of their life cycle. They are parasitic on other types of organisms, so that within their colonies they can actually be very cooperative. So yeah, it's a fun duality. I guess something else that makes this study important is that, as mentioned before, this species can infect humans, and so this study gives us some information on like possible ways that might be or might not be effective at controlling the species. So, for example, we know that if we introduce a bunch of like other flatworm species to try and outcompete this species, is probably not going to work with very well because the soldier defense is so effective in this species. So we probably can't use that as a tactic to control the numbers of Haplorchis pumilio, even though people have done that for other trematode species where they use kind of biological control, like increase the amount of competition and lower their numbers that way. But yeah, that's probably not going to work here. I guess if you're wondering, because I did not mention this earlier, um, the red-winged Melania snails, as well as the Haplorchis pumilio flatworm that infects them, originally came from Southeast Asia, but they have been introduced to other parts of the world, including California, where this study was done. So yeah, I think that's all of the my notes on this particular study. Do you have anything to add to this?
Well, I am continuously impressed with the biological complexity of animals as seemingly simple as flatworms. I mean, I I never would have imagined that you would have, a parasitic form that would produce soldiers to defend the host while the, parasite is doing its business. I
Right.
that possibility never crossed my mind. It's fascinating to know that. I guess this is the thing in several trematode species, um, which just goes to show how little I know about trematodes. Um, no, that's incredibly fascinating. And yeah, I guess that is a big question about, how to help people who get infected by these animals. Like, what's the best course of action to take? Because I have a couple of vintage animal books, and I'm familiar enough with trematodes to know the life cycles and how many different species infect people, and as well as livestock. Um, and so it just seems like one of those situations that is outside my life experience, but it's probably like a common fact of life for some people around the world daily, and it kind of puts some perspective into the things for me. Um, but no, I thought this was incredibly fascinating, and it certainly encourages me to want to try to find more news stories about flatworms or just parasites in general, and kind of make them more familiar to our audiences as you've made them familiar to me. So I thank you for picking a really cool study to talk about today.
Oh, I'm glad.
Well, in that case, then, unless there's anything else you wanted to add, we could go ahead and jump into our review.
Yeah, let's do that.
Alrighty, so as you mentioned in the introduction, we are going to be reviewing uh, the short film Prehistoric Beast, which is by Phil Tippett, as well as the stop motion sequences for the CBS documentary Dinosaur. Um, so, Prehistoric Beast is released in 1984, and the CBS series Dinosaur is released the following year, narrated by Superman, famously, Christopher Reeve. Um, and I guess really the biggest reason this came to my attention is, I like to try to be familiar with classic paleo media, and these are short films that I've been aware of for quite a while now, as we'll explain later on. And it kind of come to my realization relatively recently that there wasn't a lot of analysis on these, Phil Tippett projects. There hasn't really been a lot on the making of these, short films or even the science behind these short films. And of course, my sort of questions were answered immediately by a fellow YouTuber, fellow paleo YouTuber, Dino Diego, who made a video on prehistoric beasts itself, which we will almost certainly link in the description. We encourage you guys to check it out. Diego goes a lot into the kind of behind the scenes history of the short films, as well as on Phil Tippett's life and work. Phil Tippett, of course, uh, pioneered, along with Industrial Light and Magic, the go motion technique. So, this is a form of stop motion with blurring effects between the frames, which kind of helps create more naturalistic movements in your stop motion figures versus the sort of kind of sudden and janky movements that you used to get with more traditional stop motion. Think about like Ray Harryhausen or Rankin Bass Productions, that sort of thing. And of course, Industrial Light and Magic is the company that was behind many of the special effects that Phil Tippett also worked on for the Star Wars films. Um, I think other sci-fi films at the time. It didn't last very long, surprisingly. This was really only a late '80s phenomena, and it wasn't until the release of Jurassic Park that it was decided that the go motion process that was going to be used and pioneered by Phil Tippett in that film switched over to the up and coming underdog CGI, computer generated imagery. So perhaps in another universe, the animals of Jurassic Park would have looked a lot more like the animals in these films that we're going to talk about today. And I guess right away before we go into this review, it should be noted that Phil Tippett's contributions to Dinosaur, as well as his complete short film Prehistoric Beast, were only re-released in full a little under a decade ago, as a part of his website. He has them available for a small fee. You can purchase access to both of these films. They have been remastered and they have been restored to sort of their original brilliance. And I mean, they are pieces of art. They are very, really beautiful to watch. That said, of course, the stop motion sequences in Dinosaur, which is itself its own documentary film that aired on CBS, is just a small part of that film. And recordings of it are available on YouTube everywhere. I don't know that this has gotten a home media release. to my knowledge. VHS copies of Dinosaur may exist. I'm not sure. We haven't done really the research to look at it. Um, and so, to kind of help distinguish ourselves from Dino Diego's brilliant coverage of these films, we wanted to focus a little bit more on, of course, our perceptions and memories with these short films, and kind of go more into the science behind them. The kind of research that Phil Tippett may have done in producing uh, the restorations in these films, and kind of what we know about some of the behaviors in animals depicted. Not necessarily to say what is accurate and what is inaccurate, but to kind of show how science marches on and how these short films are excellent time capsules into the ever growing history of dinosaur research and paleontology. Does that sound good to you, buddy?
Yeah, it makes sense to me.
Excellent. So let's do a quick overview of these short films in case you all are not aware. Um, I don't think we have to necessarily worry about spoilers in this case. These are not exactly, you know, there's not exactly a lot of bombshells in these sorts of things. Um, so Prehistoric Beast is about I'd say like a 8 to 10 minute short film um, that features a snapshot of the late Cretaceous of Alberta, Canada, and we follow a monoclonius, a horned ceratopsian dinosaur, as it kind of goes about its afternoon, munching on wildflowers and just enjoying the day. And it slowly enters this ever darkening and ever creepy woodland. And lo and behold, it's being stalked by a tyrannosaur, a Tyrannosaurus proper. And there's a standoff, and the monoclonius is seemingly wiped out. And it's very much done in a sort of thriller style.
Hmm.
This is not so much a naturalistic depiction of dinosaur predation. It's almost like a mini horror film in its
Yep.
way. You are in the place of this horned dinosaur. There's sounds going about you. There's a sense of something looming that's coming that might want something to do with you, but you can't make heads or tails of it. And it's just really effectively done. And of course, the go motion animation is beautiful. You know, Seeing clips and films for years of classic stop motion dinosaurs from The Lost World to like 1 million years BC and other Ray Harryhausen projects. This is really the culmination of that technology. These are probably some of the best stop motion dinosaurs like around that have ever
Hmm.
been made, to my knowledge, at least in terms of like the past. So obviously, like people still do stop motion today, um, but back when stop motion was like standard film technology that could be used for projects, this is like the culmination of many decades of work. Now, Dinosaur is sort of a generalized documentary. Christopher Reeve comes and he narrates and hosts, and he talks kind of about the pop culture history of dinosaurs, why dinosaurs are so popular, why they resonate with people, both experts and non-specialists alike. And interspersed throughout is essentially a small little look at sort of the last days of the dinosaurs. We follow a herd of hadrosaurs as they, build a nest and raise their young. We see herds of sauropod dinosaurs feasting. We see probably the only stop motion depiction of Deinonychus, the dromaeosaur that helped pioneer the dinosaur renaissance, kind of showing their hunting behaviors. We see the Tyrannosaurus again attempting to hunt hadrosaurs. And then it ends with the Cretaceous Paleogene mass extinction event. The bolide hits the Earth and turns everything to dust. And the last of the giant dinosaurs are wiped out, only to be succeeded by a very cute cross-eyed opossum that makes an appearance at the end of the film. All done in live action, of course. Um, and these are just fascinating little bits of paleo history. And kind of what we're going to do next is kind of go over some of the animals that feature, what we know about them, and some interesting little facets of behavior and also just life history that we wanted to cover that are
Mhm.
represented in this short film and kind of what we know about them today versus in the past. And so, if we may, let's go to the next slide and meet our cast. So, these are all of the dinosaurs that feature in both Prehistoric Beast and Dinosaur. As you'll see, they are all dinosaurs. We don't really see any pterosaurs or marine reptiles in these short films. Um, First, we have our Monoclonius. This is kind of the co-star of Prehistoric Beast. It makes a small cameo appearance in Dinosaur. Um, Certainly a different individual for obvious reasons. But so Monoclonius is an interesting animal. Uh, some of you may have heard of this dinosaur before. Some of you may be under the suspicion that this is a dinosaur that's known by a different name nowadays, that being Centrosaurus. So, what I'm going to try to do before kind of going into the animal itself is kind of talk about its naming history. What exactly is and was Monoclonius, and where does it stand in paleontology today? Because you might be surprised at the answer. So, fossils of this ceratopsian were originally found in 1876 in Choteau County, Montana, not far from the Judith River Formation, and it was co-excavated by Edward Drinker Cope of the famous Bone Wars and a young Charles Sternberg, who was only 26 years old at the time and had just studied at Kansas State University before going on to spend many field seasons with Edward Cope. The fossils were found at different sites, and when combined, seemed to make up most of the dinosaur skeleton, save for the feet. That fall, the remains were described by Cope as Monoclonius crassus, the single sprout fat one. Now, contrary to what you might have read, Monoclonius means single sprout, not single horn, and that is because Cope actually based the name on the arrangement of the cheek teeth,
Hmm.
which he thought were used like mammal teeth were. So it had one mature set and one replacement set, rather than similar related animals that he had found that had double sets of teeth that would have been replaced. Now, Monoclonius was found at a time before ceratopsians were even recognized as a lineage of dinosaurs. We had like Algothalmus, for example, that was known. But again, it wasn't sure exactly what these animals were. Um, the horns and the neck frill, although found among the Monoclonius remains, were not properly identified as such. And so instead, Cope describes Monoclonius as a hadrosaurid. It's not until 1889, with the first description of Triceratops by Othniel Charles Marsh, the other of the Bone Wars duo, that Cope returned to his Monoclonius remains and realized that the two animals were actually close relatives. And just a year later, Marsh coins the name Ceratopsia, and Cope publishes a new paper redescribing Monoclonius as a horned dinosaur, with one large nasal horn and two smaller brow horns. And added to that, he names three more species for that genus. So
Hmm.
by that time, we have about four species of Monoclonius in existence. Several years later, Cope sold his fossils to the American Museum of Natural History in New York, where they would be used by another paleontologist, John Bell Hatcher, for this big monograph on ceratopsian dinosaurs. And he looked through Cope's Monoclonius specimens and seeing the clear composites and the lousy site identification, because Cope and Marsh were not very good at labeling where they found their dinosaurs,
Hmm.
um, Hatcher singled out a left parietal of the neck frill from the type specimen and erected it as the lectotype, or the new type specimen, for Monoclonius crassus. And over time, as more ceratopsian material was found in western North America, the name Monoclonius became a bit of a wastebasket for these new fossils. We know now that some of those specimens wound up being reclassified as Chasmosaurus, with one in particular earning the name Centrosaurus apertus in 1904 by paleontologist Lawrence Lambie, a big name at the time. Following a series of disputes, mainly led by Barnum Brown of the AMNH, nearly all of Cope's original monoclonius material was sunk into Centrosaurus by 1914, with the type specimen Monoclonius crassus remaining alone. But he remarked as well that the original fossils seem to have been damaged, or maybe they belonged to a particularly old individual that might have exaggerated the differences between Monoclonius and Centrosaurus. Although, of course, Barnum Brown would then go on to name a new species of Monoclonius anyway, that being Monoclonius flexus. And a year after that, Lambie responds in another paper by agreeing with the kind of fuzzy taxonomic state of Monoclonius crassus, while also sinking Brown's flexus into Centrosaurus apertus. Um, by 1917, Barnum Brown had described a much more complete fossil from Alberta, Canada, that he named Monoclonius nasicornis, and displayed that at the American Museum of Natural History, where it remains to this day. You can actually go and check it out. Oddly enough, Brown insisted that there was yet another species in the genus, and so named Monoclonius cutleri based on headless material. And so this is kind of where we got with Monoclonius. The status was in a state of flux for many decades afterwards, down to the 1990s. And of course, you can put that in the context now of Tippett's Prehistoric Beast, where we find the animal that has been identified as such. And it very much resembles the AMNA skeleton of Monoclonius nasicornis, with the inward pointing nasal horn and the down turning frill horns, um, which no doubt Phil Tippett used as reference for making his Monoclonius model. As well, Monoclonius would appear in many popular books over the time. Zdenek Burian illustrated one, for example, and so that kind of cemented its place in paleohistory. And even now, that situation remains a bit contentious. It seems that the majority of paleontologists today agree that Monoclonius is what is known as a non-diagnostic genus, or a nomen dubium. It has a dubious name. We're not exactly sure what it is, if it even is a valid animal or not. Given the scrappy nature of Cope's original type specimen and the lectotype by Hatcher, it's difficult to tell what animal those remains actually belong to. This means that the definitive placement as, these fossils represent Monoclonius, or maybe they are Centrosaurus, or maybe they are some other ceratopsian altogether, we can't make that at this time. In fact, Cope's original four species of Monoclonius face this very same status. They're all based on faulty material, some of which are misidentified parts of the skeleton. Um, and there was a later named specimen by Sternberg in 1940 called Monoclonius lowii, that is especially contentious. There are proposals for it being its unique species, or perhaps being a juvenile of another genus like Styracosaurus. And both of those have strong claims by their respective um, supporters. But nearly all of the other formally named Monoclonius specimens have been reclassified as the ceratopsian dinosaurs, including Centrosaurus. So, as a matter of fact, no, Monoclonius is not simply a old name for Centrosaurus, as some of you might have thought, and certainly as I've read elsewhere. But it's certainly a name with a lot of baggage under it that we just don't know what to do with right now. And so, I guess for our purposes of discussing prehistoric beast and dinosaur, we're going to keep calling this animal Monoclonius as it was designated. However, given the close resemblance to the AMNH mount, for which it's very likely inspired by, this is my speculation kind of coming in here, I suppose there is some justification for calling it a Centrosaurus apertus, as there was a 2014 study that found that that particular skeleton represented a middle-aged individual of that species, which would make Monoclonius nasicornis now invalid as a name. And so, Albert, I hope I gave a pretty good coverage of the situation.
Oh yeah, I mean that was an excellent overview of an extremely convoluted taxonomic history. But yes, that's as far as I'm aware, at least. I do not work on horned dinosaurs. Pretty much correct.
Yeah, and so kind of getting that out of the way. As for the animal itself, it's a really well done model. The movement gives a suggestion of weight, and an interesting, a proper large bulky animal. It doesn't move very fast. What's kind of neat is because these are animals made, in the middle of the dinosaur renaissance, and Tippett clearly had like the best information at hand that was available to him that he could use. I noticed watching some of the wide shots of this animal, it has a very Greg Paulian appearance to it.
Mm,
You know, it's not very heavily built. It's very slender. It's got particularly long limbs. It has a rather, short belly for a big herbivore, and the tail is very thin too, which is interesting to see because I know. So I mentioned Greg Paulian. So Greg Paul, who is still active, was one of the biggest artists of the dinosaur renaissance. He helped popularize more modern, rigorous approaches to restoring the anatomy of these animals, which for many years had been done by faultier methods, um, by drawing the skeleton first and then studying archosaur anatomy to get the musculature right, and actually looking at the bones and the scar tissue to show the true dimensions of the muscles and how they should attach to the body. And as a result, all of his animals looked the part. They were very active, very agile, very strongly muscled animals that more matched the skeletons than the sort of, dumpy animals that were being depicted in art for decades. And so these are reflected here in the animals in both prehistoric beast and dinosaur, certainly.
mm, mm,
And so to see the monoclonius depicted like this is very interesting to kind of get that snapshot. Whereas nowadays, ceratopsian dinosaurs, we know that they were very bulky animals. Um, Being herbivores, they would have had very large guts, so the stomach would certainly be a lot more pronounced here. Maybe less of the bones and muscle sutures would be visible on the outer skin. But otherwise, it's a very well done animal for the time, and it's neat to see that Monoclonius was chosen in the first place to be sort of the co-star of
mm.
Prehistoric Beast. You'd think that, Tippett would pick a Triceratops, right, and
Right.
call it a day, but no, he decided to pick, you know, not necessarily an obscure horned dinosaur, but certainly one that kind of takes center stage to Triceratops in terms of pop culture depictions. And I think this is probably like one of the only major appearances in both film and documentary
Mm,
of Monoclonius. Of course, I would have to dig further to see that sort of thing, but it's really neat to see. And then, of course, the other co-star of Prius is the Tyrannosaurus proper. Um, just a ferocious beast of an animal. The very first appearance of any dinosaur in the short film is just this mutilated carcass of a hadrosaur as it slowly pans up to see this tyrannosaur just going to town on the innards and making all kinds of growling and grumbling noises, it like all kind of semi shadowed in the dark so you can't really get the full visage of the animal, and then all you see of it for the rest of the short is it's just slowly creeping behind the monoclonius, and finally it pops out of the woods, mouth right at the camera, taking bites out of the monoclonius, and just grumbling and shuffling around, and it's a very ferocious and really intimidating depiction of this
mm,
animal. I know it's very easy. I mean, it might seem easy to make a tyrannosaurus, or I guess any large carnivorous theropod, seem monstrous and terrifying. And I dare say that Prehistoric Beast is the one that probably does it in one of the best ways.
yeah. Mm,
Um, because one of the neat things about go motion that Tippett used in his short and also in Dinosaur, and I will mention that Dino Diego also talks about this at length in his review as well, is that there's a lot of control of camera movement. A lot of classic CGI, excuse me, a lot of classic stop motion dinosaurs in film, you have a wide shot, and the animals are kind of placed in center stage, and that's kind of how you watch them. They'll turn around, they'll go round and around each other and do whatever they need to, but you never really see, quick shots or close ups of
mm,
these animals that are kind of rapid fire. Whereas here in Prehistoric Beast, the animals are moving really fast. The camera's turning around. It's panning this way. It's panning that way. It's panning upward, panning downward, and it really heightens the sense of movement and struggle between the
Yeah.
two animals as they face off each other. And again, that's one of those things that is kind of goes into being the culmination of stop motion for dinosaurs because prior to Phil Tippett's work, you don't really see that in film. This is really one of the only times where it was implemented in this way, and it's very effective.
Mhm.
As for the Tyrannosaurus itself, again, a very Pauly in appearance. It's got a very thin tail, very thin limbs. The facial features of the skull are visible outside the body. And it's interesting to look at interviews by Phil Tippett, where he consciously, again, based on the research that he was looking at for the dinosaur renaissance, consciously chose to have the Tyrannosaurus tail raised in the air as a
Mhm.
counterbalance, as we now know in these animals and in most dinosaurs. Um, so he was kind of one of the first to really emphasize that in a stop motion sense. So this is not a tripedal walking kangaroo of a dinosaur that we're used to seeing in older literature. This is sort of one of the first looks at the modern Tyrannosaurus, um, which is fascinating to see. And otherwise, it looks really good. Um, I could easily see it passing off as a sort of immature, maybe young adult individual.
Mhm.
Um, maybe needs a little bit more meat on the bones, maybe some filamentous structures, but otherwise, again, for 1984, these are excellent dinosaurs,
Yeah.
and they're certainly very well depicted in the short. Now, moving on to Dinosaur itself, um, of course, our main animals are a group of hadrosaurs, and this is where I had a little bit of confusion because watching Dinosaur, they are described as hadrosaurs
Hmm.
or hadrosaur. They're not really given a genus name.
Hmm.
So I'm not exactly sure what animals these are supposed to represent. Um, they might. I've read some reviews that saying that it might just be Hadrosaurus itself.
Hmm.
Although they very clearly look like Edmontosaurus,
Right.
which of course is the big late Cretaceous North American hadrosaurid that was a contemporary of Tyrannosaurus. Um, but to my knowledge, like I can neither confirm nor deny that identification. So for now, these are just hadrosaurs themselves. And Albert, I understand you have some information about their uh, life and nesting behaviors that you'd want to clarify too.
Yeah, a little bit. So yeah, the depiction of hadrosaurs in this short, or at least in these sequences, is quite interesting because I think, regardless of what they're actually meant to represent, it is almost certainly inspired by a lot of the information that was coming out at the time about Maiasaura, which is also a hadrosaur species that lived in the late Cretaceous in North America, but a little bit earlier than Edmontosaurus and T Rex. The really key thing about Maiasaura, and from a scientific perspective, is that it provided some of the first direct evidence of the nesting behaviors of Mesozoic dinosaurs, and furthermore, evidence of parental care in Mesozoic dinosaurs, and that kind of, in many ways, paved the way to us viewing these extinct dinosaurs as perhaps in some ways being more bird or even mammal-like in their behavior than like typical reptiles. Um, and so they kind of depict that in these sequences here, because much of the focus of these films is on like this pair of hadrosaurs raising their young. So they're first shown um, having made a nest, which is kind of you can kind of see in this screenshot here, which is a sort of hollowed out mound that's scooped out in the middle, and we see in the film that is aligned with vegetation. And then they had about like what, like six or so eggs, a half a dozen laid in there, and you could see the eggs poking out from the vegetation in the film. Eventually, well, most of the eggs get devoured by a dinosaur we'll talk about later, Struthiomimus, but one survives, and then you see the baby hadrosaur hatch, and as it gets a little bigger, it accompanies its parents out on foraging trips, and they drop some food, plant material from the trees to feed it, and also defend it against a tyrannosaur. Um, so a lot of this is probably inspired by the new information coming out at the time about parental care in hadrosaurs. And well, how does it hold up? Um, well, in general, the basic premise that hadrosaurs, probably took care of their young, as far as I know, is still supported by the evidence that was presented back then. There has been some debate about whether or not the babies could leave the nest or not, although I think the current thinking at the moment is that the newly hatched babies at least were probably confined to the nest. But that being said, there has been some new information that has come out about the nest structure of these dinosaurs that would probably change depictions. If this behavior were to be depicted today, we would probably do it differently in a number of ways. So, first of all, is that we probably wouldn't show the eggs as being like exposed in the nest. So people have done, since this documentary came out, people have done studies looking at the eggshell, the microscopic eggshell structure of the eggs in hadrosaurs and other types of dinosaurs. And it turns out that from the eggshell structure, you can often make a pretty good guess as to whether or not these eggs were incubated by being buried underneath either soil or sand or kind of exposed like they are in birds today. So birds today, the parents use their body heat to incubate the eggs, right? Or at least most species do. So the eggs are not like buried in any kind of structure. Now, as it turns out in hadrosaurs, the evidence is that the eggs were probably buried. And that makes sense because hadrosaurs were much too big to actually sit on their eggs to keep them warm. So probably, specifically, they were probably buried under some kind of organic rich substrate. So very likely like mounds of rotting vegetation, which is how alligators today do it, for example. And some types of megapode birds do that today. So megapodes are a group of birds from Australasia, mostly, a little bit in Southeast Asia. And they're like basically the only birds alive today that do not use their own body heat to incubate their eggs. So some species will bury their eggs under like these big mounds of vegetation, similar to what alligators and it seems what hadrosaurs did. Also, the number of eggs that are shown. In Maiasaura, at least, like the number of eggs there were in each nest has been estimated as like somewhere in the range of like 30 eggs, which is similar again in size to the number of eggs that things like alligators and crocodiles lay. But we see far fewer eggs depicted in this film. So yeah, that's something else that would probably be different if we were to show this today. But it is kind of interesting, right? Because of course, doing the dinosaur effects is very time and effort and money consuming. And so the way that the plot proceeds has most of the eggs being eaten, and so they only have to like animate, so to speak, one baby hadrosaur for the rest of the story, which is kind of an interesting way to deal with that issue. And it probably is not completely unrealistic after all. Like animals that produce so many young usually do get most of the young picked off by predators at some point or another. So it wouldn't be too far fetched for like most of the clutch of hadrosaur eggs perhaps to be wiped out at least occasionally. Like I mentioned earlier, there is evidence that at least the newly hatched hadrosaurs were probably like staying in the nest and being tended to by their parents, and we don't know if like both parents were taking care of them as is shown here or only one. That's data that we do not have. Something else is that the Maiasaura nests are found like in colonies, basically. Like we know, like a bunch of Maiasaura came together to kind of nest in like one area together, like forming these big nesting colonies, as some animals do today. Like many types of birds today will get together and form these big breeding colonies. Whereas in the film, we only see like a single parent, a single nest in one small area. Um, Obviously, we don't know whether all hadrosaurs had the nesting colony behavior or not. So if these are not actually meant to be Maiasaura, then of course there is some leeway as to the types of behaviors that you can show. But it is like interesting that they did not go with the colonial nesting. Of course, partly probably because of like time and budget and effort reasons. Um, when hadrosaurs got older, there is some evidence that the juvenile hadrosaurs, when they got a little bigger and weren't staying in the nest anymore, were probably forming like groups of their own, like separate from the adults. And this seems to have been the case for a lot of Mesozoic dinosaurs. We have quite a lot of examples of Mesozoic dinosaurs of many different groups, like ornithischians and theropods, where we find like groups of like not fully grown individuals, but not like baby individuals together. And they seem to form these age segregated groups that are like separate from the adults and the babies. A funny analogy I've seen for this behavior is from Dr. Holtz's classes, where he says that if you want to see this kind of behavior in a modern animal, then just visit any shopping mall, because yeah, you will see like a lot of adolescent humans hanging out in groups there, separate from their parents and their younger siblings. I would say like again, like this was a very up to date view of like dinosaur behavior for its time for sure. Even though it's been outdated in terms of some details, I still think it's definitely a very impressive work. Like I would say, just like not just with hadrosaurs, but just in general. I would echo a lot of what you said earlier. Like first of all, the effects in the cinematography, they still hold up really well today. Like these films are very atmospheric, especially prehistoric beasts. Like you mentioned, how it has that horror vibe to it. And that's very effective, I think. And the dinosaurs themselves too. Yeah, I would say like these dinosaurs, they are clearly born out of the dinosaur renaissance. And I think like if you were to show these dinosaurs like in a modern film, for example, like they wouldn't be like 100% up to date or like completely modern in style. But I would say like if I saw these like in a modern film, I would say they would be a pretty darn good effort at depicting a realistic view of these animals. Like there would be like some minor things that would need to be changed, but like overall, like they still hold up remarkably well. That definitely something that reflects like the context of the time in which they were made. So yeah, I think that's most of what I had prepared to say for this. So you can feel free to continue down the roster if you like.
Oh, certainly. So, as you mentioned a little earlier, our hadrosaur parents have most of their babies snatched away by another dinosaur. This, of course, being Struthiomimus, which we have pictured here in the middle. Now, Struthiomimus is one of the so-called ostrich dinosaurs, or ornithomimosaurs, that are characterized by, I mean, really ostrich-like bodies. They had very long necks connected to really small heads, with kind of short bodies with long forelimbs and a long tail for balancing in the back. Um, it's generally, these animals are generally depicted as rather speedy animals, able to make really fast bursts. I know several literature has described them as some of the fastest of the non-avian dinosaurs if they were matching similar ostrich type speeds, which I suppose is pretty fair given the fact that their hind limbs they seem to be adapted for long distance locomotion. They have lost the hallux, for example, the the sort of dew claw that you often see in other dinosaurs. And usually when your feet are losing digits, that's a sign that you're well that's one possible sign is that you're using it to move faster
Yeah.
or move longer, make it more efficient. For example, the modern ostrich itself, of course, only has two toes, something that's often lost in depictions of the animals in cartoons, but that's a story for another day. Now, Albert, I understand you did a little bit of research on our Struthiomimus friend. It's sort of depicted in the film as the classic egg stealer dinosaur. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so yeah, I mean, to be clear, I haven't done like formal scientific research on these dinosaurs, although I'm quite interested by them. Um, but yes, I did look into this topic for this episode, and of course was like fairly aware of these topics beforehand. So yes, the diet of ornithomimid dinosaurs has been quite a mystery, for a long time, and to an extent, it still is. Because these dinosaurs are very curious in terms of their skull anatomy, essentially, um, because they're clearly a type of theropod dinosaur, and typically theropod dinosaurs are meat eaters. Yet, ornithomimids only had toothless beaks. Um, and so there has been a lot of historically there has been a lot of debate and speculation about exactly what they ate because we don't have their teeth to look at, so we can't use that as a method, which we normally do for determining dinosaur diet. Um, and yeah, so what is going on with them? Um, well, some people assume that, these are theropods, so they must have been eating other animals to some extent, right? But they have like these small heads and like relatively weak-looking jaws, so they clearly couldn't have hunted animals that were very big or very or similar in size to them. And so, probably because of this, there came about the speculation that they were often feeding on the eggs of other dinosaurs. Um, and that's not a completely unreasonable speculation. So the eggs of other dinosaurs would have been very abundant in Mesozoic habitats. I mentioned earlier about how hadrosaurs laid like at least 30 eggs at a time. And if you think about how big these nesting colonies were, well, that's a lot of food for something that likes to eat eggs, right? Um, it's quite an interesting speculation, and you see this depicted in a lot of classic like artwork, like paleo art, for example, and even in cartoons like The Land Before Time. I know the Land Before Time series, not the first movie, but the series of films, um, had like one installment where there were like these two ornithomimid characters that were like obsessed with eating eggs, and I think that's become a bit of a mini meme because like they sing a song about wanting to eat eggs in the movie, and apparently that's kind of been a bit of a mimetic thing on the internet nowadays. So this depiction of them was very popular in like popular literature. Um, that being said, there never was any like very good evidence of them eating eggs, and like the actual shape of their skull, for example, or their beaks, like it doesn't seem like something that's like specialized for going into eggs. So, like I'm sure if it found a cracked egg or like it was able to get into an egg, an ornithomimid probably would be willing to eat an egg. Um, but there really isn't much reason to think that this was something they were doing on a regular basis. Um, Okay, so, if they weren't mostly eating eggs, then what were they eating? I guess here the ostrich comparison is not a bad way to start. Like ostriches and other like large ground-dwelling birds today, they have these like relatively small heads, and their beaks are, I would say, they're relatively generalized. So it seems like they could potentially be used to eat a wide variety of foods, and ostriches and similar birds tend to be primarily herbivorous, so they mostly eat plants, but they're definitely willing to eat other things like insects or small vertebrates as well. And certainly a diet like that seems at least plausible for the ornithomimids. Um, and in recent years, people have done like a bit more study on like their functional anatomy, and it would seem that a lot of their anatomy is at least consistent with a primarily plant-eating diet. So, like the beak, for example, it seems that it would make sense if their beak was used primarily for like cropping plants, so like maybe pulling or like slicing leaves off of branches. And they didn't have a very strong bite force, which has been estimated in recent studies. So they were probably like uh, using the neck to kind of pull up like pieces of vegetation from whatever from either trees or from the ground, which is how a lot of the large plant eating birds today do it. Um, and their forelimbs too actually might have been involved in this activity. So ornithomimids actually have very distinctive looking forelimbs, even though that's not usually what the books tell you to focus on. So the fingers, of which they have three on each hand, similar to many of the other bird-like theropods, um, the fingers on each hand are nearly the same length as each other, which is very unusual for theropods. In most theropods, like the thumb is basically much shorter than the other fingers, and the second finger is longer than the others. But in ornithomimids, like they almost reach the same length, um, and their claws on their hands are a little bit sickle shaped almost. So actually, if you compare them to modern animals, they're almost a little bit like you could see a resemblance to the claws of sloths of all things. Now, the rest of the anatomy of ornithomimids suggests that they're definitely not, hanging upside down in trees like sloths are. Like their hind limbs are so long, and the hind limb claws are definitely not good for climbing. Um, and so they're definitely not like doing the sloth thing. But it may be that they were using like their front claws for a sort of similar kind of behavior where they're like using them to clamp down on branches and pull them down. In that sense, you can see why having fingers that are almost equal in length and having like these sickle-like claws would be useful. They could make the hand into a sort of hook, and then they could pull branches down towards a mouth where they could be, nibbled at with that beak. So it seems, at least at the moment, this feels like the best supported model for at least the feeding habits of Struthiomimus and its friends. Now, something else I should mention is that in the early 2000s, there was another alternative suggestion for the kind of feeding habits of ornithomimids. And it was suggested that they might have been filter feeders of all things, which is quite a different way of life. So it was suggested that, similar to a flamingo, ornithomimids would go out and wade out into the water and use their beaks to filter out like small particles of food, like maybe algae or little crustaceans that are swimming around. So similar to flamingos or ducks, the way that they feed today. This is depicted in the mid 2000s pseudo documentary series hosted by Nigel Marvin, Prehistoric Park, where they showed the ornithomimus feeding in this way. So they like Prehistoric Park. The premise of it is that they have like this modern a wildlife park in modern day, but they travel back in time to like, capture extinct animals and bring them back to the modern day to like rear in this park. And then they run into all kinds of shenanigans, like not only trying to catch the animals, but also trying to take care of them as well. One of the plot points in that series was that the ornithomimids, the ornithomimus that they caught, it turns out that they weren't feeding like ostriches, but more like ducks instead. So they had to give like the ornithomimus a big pond for them to feed from, and they became a lot happier when they had that pond. Yeah, that was a hypothesis that was around for a while, but in more recent times, it has also fallen out of favor because it was basically based on the idea that people were looking at the structure of the beak in the preserved structure of the beak in ornithomimids and thought that they saw like these filter feeding structures in them, or at least like places that could support filter feeding structures. But it turns out that these inferences were not very well established. It turns out that a lot of like beaked animals, like sea turtles that don't filter feed, also have like these little ridges and stuff inside their beak that aren't used for filter feeding. And so that this was not a very strong inference as to support filter feeding or ornithomimids. So we don't really think that they did that anymore. It still seems like kind of primarily plant eating behavior, and maybe occasionally eating some small animals on the side. Sounds like the best supported idea for ornithomimids at the moment. So yeah, we also don't have a lot of direct evidence of what they were eating, like stomach contents or anything, but we have found ornithomimids preserved with a lot of gizzard stones. So, of course, a lot of animals today, including birds, many types of birds at least will swallow stones to help them grind up their food, especially animals that don't have any teeth to do the food processing for them. And ornithomimids, too, had these gizzard stones, and the number and the size of gizzard stones that they have are quite similar to the gizzard stones that accumulate in the digestive system of modern big plant-eating birds today. Yeah, I think in that regard, we do have several lines of evidence supporting that type of behavior. So yes, yeah, the Struthiomimus being depicted as a primarily like, or at least like habitual egg thief in this movie is definitely not the best supported model for their lifestyle at the moment. And in fact, ornithomimids are not the only like Mesozoic theropod to have been depicted with this lifestyle. I'm sure if you're familiar with dinosaurs, you have heard about Oviraptor and the other Oviraptorosaurs, which around this time as well were speculated to have been like primarily egg-eating animals, and they're a very similar story because they're also a group of, at least in many cases, toothless theropods, and so people were like, "What on earth were they eating?" I mean, they probably weren't hunting, like ripping flesh, right? And so what else could they eat? Well, eggs. But of course, there's another layer to this, in that Oviraptorosaurs were often actually found associated with eggs, which we later found was not because they were eating these eggs, but more because they were sitting on them to incubate them, like birds would today. And so it turns out that they were being found preserved with their own eggs and not in the middle of stealing other dinosaurs' eggs. Yeah, oviparitosaurs are very cool too, but this film is not about them, so I think we should move on. But yeah, you can tell just from the name oviraptor, meaning egg thief, that they were kind of depicted in a very similar manner. And in fact, I feel like a lot of people like reading books or like even making dinosaur books at the time often got these two groups confused because you have these two different groups of mostly toothless theropods that were often shown eating eggs. But yeah, the ornithomimosaurs and oviraptorosaurs, two different things. Yeah, I guess one last thing I should mention about the Struthiomimus here is that, of course, if this was made in modern day, um, they would be depicted with feathers. Like we have like direct evidence that ornithomimosaurs were covered in feathers, and in fact they were feathered in a somewhat similar way, at least in the examples that we found, to an ostrich, where they seem to have had like longer feathers on the forelimbs and their hind limbs and the underside of their tail, at least in Ornithomimus, which is the species or genus where we have feathers, direct feather evidence of where we're naked. So the hind limbs and the underside of the tail were covered in just like bare skin, basically, which is similar to the condition in an ostrich. It makes sense for an animal that runs around a lot and has to run very fast, so they could lose heat from the hind limbs. Yeah, and the structure of the feathers too was probably not quite like the flight feathers in a modern bird, but a bit more shaggy looking. So yeah, quite a lot like an ostrich. So basically, yeah, in many ways, these dinosaurs were probably doing the ostrich thing, but in the Mesozoic. So yeah, feel free to add or like continue on with anything you might want to say.
No, for sure. And it's interesting, like to go from one Maniraptora form to another. So after our Struthiomimus destroys most of the nest and runs off with one, it's chased off by one of the parents. It kind of gets its karma, if you want to think of it like that, because as it retreats into the woodlands to feast on its cache, it is stalked and then attacked by two Deinonychus. Now, if the list of dinosaurs shown here is anything to go by, there is that weird instance of they're combining animals from different times and places
Yep.
into the same landscape within 66, or I guess in this case 65 million years ago. The Deinonychus are seen stalking and then ambush hunting the Struthiomimus. There's a small chase through the woods, and eventually the two of them corner the animal and disembowel it with their simple claws. Now, of course, Deinonychus, as depicted, is interesting to see here. I think I dare say this is the only stop motion that has been released
Right.
depiction of a dromaeosaur uh, in paleomedia. Because of course, Phil Tippett worked on Jurassic Park. He made stop motion test footage of the Velociraptors in that one, which is interesting history, but we don't have time to talk about that. Of course, Deinonychus is a very important dinosaur in paleontology. It was described, well, it was described many years prior to its formal publication because Barnum Brown and colleagues had found different remains that had been given different names. Kind of a weird mixed history. So it's not until 1969 that John Ostrom, paleontologist at Yale, uh, described more complete remains and officially published papers and a monograph on the animal itself, further clarifying its appearance and possible life history. And the reason why Deinonychus is so important was, as we mentioned, it's kind of the kickstarter of the dinosaur renaissance in a way. Um, Picture like, the early 60s or most of the 60s, where dinosaurs are being depicted not much different from how they were in the 20s and 40s. They were unsuccessful animals. They were very slow and plodding. They dragged their tails. They were kind of like mindless automatons, just walking, wandering the landscape, coming into contact with each other, and just kind of waiting to die out so the mammals and humans can take over. And so enter Deinonychus, and what is very clearly a dinosaur, but also like a very active looking animal that was clearly running, keeping its tail balanced up in the air, and being an effective predator because, why would you have huge knives on your feet if you weren't using them to kick at your prey and dismember them? This is very undinosaurian like behavior, as was the norm at the time. And so Deinonychus comes in and completely sweeps a lot of that from the table, and subsequently helps lead to a revaluation of dinosaur life history. New research is kickstarted, new interest in dinosaurs has spawned because prior to the dinosaur renaissance, that image of dinosaurs as unsuccessful animals meant that they were very boring to work on. paleontologists wanted to work on mammals and understand them a little bit better. So dinosaur research didn't grind to a halt, but it definitely was less than what it was before, and certainly a lot less than what it is now, where there's dinosaur mania everywhere. Everybody understands now that dinosaurs were very active animals, or at least I would like to think everybody understands. And Deinonychus certainly paved the way for a lot of that. So seeing it depicted here in 1985 is really interesting. I don't believe this is the first depiction of it in media, but it's definitely one of the earliest ones that had a wide distribution. And I mean, obviously, again, as you mentioned with Struthiomimus, it would have looked quite different today. A fully feathered animal with more complex feathers than Struthiomimus. Very bird-like wings on the arms and on the hind limbs and on the tail. But of course, that's neither here nor there. I mean, the depiction here, as it was at the time, was very state of the art. The look of the animal is very much the Robert Bacher illustration that he used to go with the Deinonychus papers that John Ostrom had published. Showing a very sleek, slender animal that could run really fast, um, and kind of held its arms close to its body. And it's depicted as such here. And they're really nasty little things too. I love how they're done in the film. They finish taking down the Struthiomimus and they just kind of like look at the camera. Their mouths are all bloody and their eyes are red and they're kind of like, yeah, like we're nasty little dinosaurs. Um, so it's really fun to see. Well, for one, a stop motion depiction of Deinonychus itself, because it almost seems out of place. Stop motion is usually seen as like with the dinosaurs of yesteryear. Um, but nope, Deinonychus seemingly made it into the culmination of dinosaur stop motion. It kind of reminds me of like me learning recently that Zdenek Burian actually depicted a Deinonychus in his artwork. So he was alive long enough to depict, a Deinonychus in a very Bacherian manner, um, which is interesting because usually he's associated with his earlier artworks from like the 50s and 60s of the, again, traditional plodding dinosaurs. But nope, he was certainly around, and there's a lot of artwork. His most recent artworks before he passed depicted, very Bacherian dinosaurs. There's a artwork of his Barosaurus, for example, that's particularly popular. And so seeing the Deinonychus here is really fascinating, and also the Brontosaurus too.
Yeah.
And yes, this is meant to be a Brontosaurus. They're very explicit about that in the documentary. Again, what the Brontosaurus doing in the late Cretaceous of North America, I mean, we're not really focused on that. It's but yes, it is a late Jurassic dinosaur instead. Now, of course, I am not, being ignorant in calling it Brontosaurus because for those of you not in the know, it does seem like Brontosaurus is a name that is back into paleontological fashion than what it was in the past. Um, it's another animal like Monoclonius, where its name has had a very complex history. But at least Brontosaurus is a little bit tidier nowadays. So the long and short of it, Marsh, um, Othniel Charles Marsh, discovers Apatosaurus in 1877. 2 years later, he discovers Brontosaurus from much better remains. Of course, the fossils are excavated and redistributed and published and displayed in popular museums where they're visited by many people from around the world. Um, Fast forward to 1903, when it was proposed that the remains of Brontosaurus looked far too much like Apatosaurus for it to justify being a distinct genus of dinosaur. And so it is then argued, and I guess successfully implemented, that Brontosaurus is sunk into Apatosaurus. Now, I should mention that talking about Brontosaurus, I'm talking about Brontosaurus excelsius. Um, so a specific species that has been sunk into Apatosaurus. There have been other Apatosaurus species that have been described as well. The details there are not necessarily important right now, but it's not that like so it's not accurate to say that like we found Brontosaurus and then we decided to just call it Apatosaurus. It's more complicated than that. But given its popular placement in museums at the time, and just how expensive it is to renovate museums and change signs and that sort of thing, Brontosaurus ended up stuck in popular culture for decades onward. Even though in science nobody was really talking about Brontosaurus as a legitimate animal, or as its own animal, popular media just ran with it. And today, well, at the time, most people were more familiar with Brontosaurus than with Apatosaurus. And of course, there were a couple paleontologists that wanted to promote Brontosaurus as a name, even despite this taxonomic change. I know Bacher, for example, Dr. Robert Bacher, um, really liked the name Brontosaurus and pioneered its use as a common name for sauropods in general. In fact, in 1986, just a year after Dinosaur premiered, he publishes the Dinosaur Heresies, and he's referring to the Apatosaurus as Brontosaurus.
Hmm.
And given that he features in the Dinosaur documentary, I'm sure he helped with the designation of Brontosaurus in this film too. But alas, it is in 2015 with Emmanuel T-Shop and colleagues, and I apologize if I butchered the name, um, reevaluated Brontosaurus and Apatosaurus on a specimen-based level. So they performed a phylogenetic analysis of not just representative species, but all the specimens that they could of sauropod dinosaurs. And they had found that while they were both close relatives, Brontosaurus had justification for being a distinct animal with actually rather distinct anatomy from Apatosaurus itself. And so they propose, and it seems to have carried on into present times, that Brontosaurus excelsius is a valid name again. And so in this instance, then, we can be more confident about calling this animal Brontosaurus than, say, calling Monoclonius its name itself.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I, again, am impressed with all the animals in these short films, but the Brontosaurus really impresses me the most. I think because given the recent research in sauropod biology and anatomy, what we really have is a sort of prescient depiction of a modern sauropod in this 1985 documentary. As you can see from the image here, the neck is kind of held in an upright position, not necessarily like a swan, but sort of kind of raised with the head facing downwards. That's based on recent research, particularly two main papers from 2009 and 2013 by Mike Taylor, Matt Waddell, and Darren Naish on the head and neck posture of sauropod dinosaurs, based on their comparisons with living vertebrate species and how they held their necks in life. And what they had found is that most living vertebrates, including things like salamanders and rabbits, where you'd think that they wouldn't have necks to begin with,
Hmm.
um, all have their neck vertebrae kind of like poking out and then in a sort of angled posture, like in the air, like at rest in life, not like exerting any of its own energies or anything. And so, if you extrapolate that to extinct vertebrates like sauropod dinosaurs, that essentially would mean that the neck was held regularly in life in a sort of upright position. And it matches very close to what we see here in Dinosaur. And so I'm certainly very impressed to see how they were able to kind of make a depiction of these animals that ends up lasting into the
Hmm.
present day as something that, like, if I saw this in a modern documentary, I'd be like, yeah, that checks out. That looks about, how we, view sauropods to have held themselves. And of course, their sequence is kind of the odd one out in Dinosaur.
Hmm.
Like everything that we follow with the hadrosaurs and the Struthiomimus and the Deinonychus and the Tyrannosaurus is all connected with each other. But then we just kind of like look at the Brontosaurus for a
Yeah.
moment. We just take a break from everybody else and like, hey, look at these cool animals. And it's a rather humorous sequence in and of itself because you have a herd of these animals just feasting from the trees. One rears on its hind limbs. Again, another behavior that we understand now has a scientific basis for it. It seems to have been within the realm of anatomical possibility for at least diplodocene sauropods, and they just kind of strip the forest bare, which I know there are questions about sauropod feeding behaviors, but it is more or less in line with large multi-ton herbivores. They would pass through a forest and probably strip the place clean before moving on to continue filling up their appetites. And of course, the animals themselves, like besides posture-wise, they look pretty good, anatomically speaking. We don't get a really good look at their hind limbs, so I'm
Hmm.
not sure how to comment on like the arrangement of the toes, for example. That's a specific case with diplodocine sauropods. They kind of had a beamed foot. All the digits are encased in sort of like a mitten with the claw, the thumb claw, sticking out. And it's a very weird arrangement. It's not what you think of when you think of sauropod dinosaurs. Like they're
Hmm.
usually depicted with elephantine feet with like nails. But it's like no, these animals had like one claw and a nailless mitten, and that's how
Hmm.
they walked around with. And then certainly this has a lot to do with supporting their weight, being as large as they are. Um, and likewise, I couldn't really tell where the nostril placement was on these
Hmm.
animals. I don't know if they had you know, the modern, forward-facing nostrils on the tip of the snout that we know that these animals had, or if they had the sort of classic nostrils are where the nares is, right in the middle of the forehead, which we see, for example, in the Brachiosaurus in Jurassic Park. That's why it sneezes out of its forehead, because it was believed that the nostrils opened where the nares was, which happens to be in the center of the forehead. Of course, now we know that that probably has less to do with where the nose opens than more of it may have been an opening for a particular nasal chamber, maybe a vocalization organ for these animals, display feature. There are different hypotheses based upon the skeletal evidence. But regardless, this is a very good brontosaurus for 1985. And so, of course, now it comes to the part that's a little bit sad.
Hmm.
If we go to the next slide, we have some screenshots from both Dinosaur and, of course, the remastered Dinosaur sequences on Tippett's studio. And the short ends with the mass extinction event at the end of the Cretaceous period, the Cretaceous Paleogene mass extinction event, to be precise. Of course, the one in which a bolide, a space rock, crashes into the Earth and sends up a rapid change of environmental effects, which wipes out the non avian dinosaurs. Now, I kind of went into a bit of a rabbit hole with this because, given its age in relation to the famous origin of this asteroid hypothesis, what we might have is the earliest depiction of this sort of modern look at the KPG. So to specify here, so the end sequence of Dinosaur, we have the bolide hitting, and it causes a huge flash in the sky. All the dinosaurs are confused. There's a brief global earthquake as the tremors from the impact site radiate across the planet. The animals are disoriented, they're kind of knocked about, and they're panicking. And then we cut to some several scenes where there's a period of dust and clouds that darken the sky. They blot out the sun, and the earth kind of dries up as photosynthesis shuts down. It becomes a sort of desolate desert. There's no discernible plant life alive on the surface. All the trees are husks. And the dinosaurs just collapse from starvation, and they're all gone because they have nothing left to eat. And we end with a particularly sad shot of one of the hadrosaur parents looking over a new nest that they attempted to make, while their partner lies dead on the side and all the eggs have been destroyed. And it, mourns in the distance. And thus we cut to, the sequence with the skeletons on the ground and the little opossum, which kind of cheers everything up a little bit. So that's kind of how they depict the KPG bolide impact in Dinosaur. Um, Now, animation for this sequence likely began and was completed in by mid 1985 because the documentary aired in November of that year. Walter and Luis Alvarez, so researchers associated with the Cretaceous extinction research, they published their hypothesis that a bolide ended the Mesozoic era in June of 1980. And they interpreted that based upon spikes in iridium, first in Italy and then at sites around the world. And it was, of course, understood that the element iridium is more commonly found in space rocks than on the Earth's surface. And for there to be this consistent band right where the Mesozoic ends and the Cenozoic begins, that led to their hypothesis that, well, clearly the one thing that would have made this was a bolide, a huge bolide that must have hit somewhere on the Earth and showered all this iridium across it as the effects unfolded. And of course, that being said, that means that this documentary film, Dinosaur, covered the impact hypothesis just less than 5 years after the publication of that paper. Now, I wanted to see how the documentary actually covered the bolide itself, because of course the remastered Tippett sequences are just played as is. There's no narration or nothing. The extinction happens, and there's no like narration saying, "And now we come to the end," and nothing like that. And so all that we really get, to a bit of my disappointment, honestly, in Dinosaur is it outlines the hypothesis that I just gave for how the bolide caused the global extinction. There's a short interview with Robert Bacher and his skepticism, which was popular at the time, of the hypothesis, because he got into the idea that was proposed many decades prior that climate changes at the end of the Cretaceous period, the so-called Maastrichtian regression, which means that sea levels were dropping all around the world, opened up land bridges. And so you have animal communities that were once isolated on different land masses are now able to disperse and interact with each other. And which I guess is a thing that is supposed to happen in living animals, according to Bucker. Diseases were shared. And because all the dinosaurs were now back in contact with each other, they just made each other sick and killed each other off. And that's how the Mesozoic ends. Um, of course, that's again followed by very brief interviews with Phil Currie and Jack Horner, who also feature in Dinosaur, which amount to basically we just don't know right now. We're more interested in dinosaurs as they lived, and that's that. So the documentary does not mention the Alvarez team by name, nor how they came to their proposals to begin with. It just presents it as is, which I'm like, oh, okay, well, that's underwhelming. But I suppose if this is a more general audience documentary, maybe you don't want to get bogged down with too many chemical details. Um, that's my guess. Now, what is interesting about this documentary, if you watch the Tippett remastered shorts for Dinosaur, you don't see the looming asteroid approaching the Earth like you do in Dinosaur, because that footage actually originates from a 1979 film called Meteor, which features a plot about humans trying to stop an approaching asteroid. Um, Now, of course, much smaller asteroid impacts have been known by humans for millennia, and many have hit known sites in recent history. But the pop culture fascination with extinction level asteroid events actually predates the Alvarez hypothesis, going back to at least the early 20th century. And so the connection of such events with the then hypothesis of a bolide impact ending the world of the dinosaurs happened almost immediately, especially following the release of Walter Alvarez's 1997 book, T-Rex and the Crater of Doom, which they incorporated newer research at the time and further elaborated and fleshed out their model for the end of the dinosaurs. Which is funny because 1997, just a year later, you get Deep Impact and Armageddon releasing in theaters, and the former film actually makes deliberate and clear references to the KPG event. And so clearly, the public and the film industry is fascinated by the idea that maybe the Mesozoic ended with a bolide impact, and so they just funneled that into as many films as they could. Um, of course, it's by this point, by 1997, that evidence for and interpretations of the Alvarez hypothesis had been heavily debated to almost personal insult. I mean, there's a long history of back and forth name calling and attacks by researchers. Again, nothing new in science, I suppose. But of course, connections to the Chicxulub crater, which had actually been rediscovered from oil rig studies, had been made to the KPG event, including dated samples that placed it at the terminal Cretaceous. So by 1997, we at least had a potential crater. Um, but of course, nowadays, um, it seems extremely likely. Like this is the best case hypothesis and model that we have We know that there was a bolide. We know that it hit the Yucatan Peninsula, and it seems to have been the most likely, if not the only cause, for the chain of events that ended the Mesozoic era. There have been attempts to combine that hypothesis with other models or events in Earth history at the time. For example, the Deccan traps in India, the eruptions, the huge magma fields. Like that's a very popular. That was a very popular idea that the two of them combined did the dinosaurs in. But last I heard, it seems like the bolide focused model is the best that we have.
Mm, mm,
For one thing that we know it existed. We have the crater. Like core samples have been excavated from the crater. Like the timing of events is really well documented
mm,
nowadays.
mm,
So certainly nowadays we are no longer in the what killed the dinosaurs. We just don't know. There are many ideas. No, like we're pretty confident that it was a bolide that did it in, and we know that it existed in the first place. So there's that. But I say all this because, to my knowledge, Dinosaur is the first such film to depict the event
mm.
as it might have happened at the end of the Cretaceous period. The very first, and it's thanks to our friend Henry actually that I made contact with. I was made aware that in 1981, so just a year after the Alvarez paper, the first Alvarez paper, there's a 1981 episode of Nova called The Asteroid and the Dinosaur that features a more in depth discussion of the Alvarez hypothesis, but it does not depict the impact or its effects on the Earth's inhabitants. In fact, in terms of animation, um, we've really come a long way in paleo documentaries because the only life depictions of dinosaurs in that Nova episode is an artist on their easel drawing out the animals and describing them as he's drawing them, and the
Mm.
camera is focused on his pencil work. And occasionally, like the camera effects will take in, and the animal will come alive and run across a painted landscape. But that's it. We don't see the looming asteroid or the chaos that ensues. So, as far as I can tell, Dinosaur, 1985, first time we see the KPG event depicted. And
Wow.
that just makes it another a reason why this is such a cool time capsule
Mm.
of the state of paleontology. Um, and I appreciate it so much more that way. Now, as far as the accuracy of things today, the general trend of bolide causes rapid environmental change that most organisms can adapt to, like that remains strong. That's more or less still accurate today. So it's more about specifics, as it is with the appearances of the animals, that would change how this would look if this was made today. So one of the biggest things I can think of is that following the impact event, you'd have this raining of molten glass that covered the Earth within hours of the impact. That would be a major factor in the depictions if it was done today. This has been proposed to have caused a rapid increase in heat in the atmosphere, which turned much, if not most, of the Earth's surface into a sort of fiery oven that would have killed off almost all of the large animals immediately, perhaps within like a day or two. Um, and so, in contrary to what we see here in the documentary of some of the last dinosaurs being big herbivores, it probably would not be the giant non-avian dinosaurs that were the last to go,
Mm.
but
Mm.
the smallest of the non-avian dinosaurs that could not, weather the effects of the calamity. I think one sequence that would likely be included if this was made today is the impact on coastlines and waterways.
Mm.
As given that the bolide hit ocean, there would have been enormous and deadly tsunamis that would have wrecked the southern North American coasts, especially from the earthquakes that caused by the events. And I mean, these walls of water would have been like enormous, like they
Mm.
would have engulfed whole sauropod herds, like just the bad place to be in if you're a dinosaur. So I could see that being included. Um, One last thing on this, I think the depiction of the Earth as a dark, dusty landscape in the months after the impact, I'd say that would probably be shown a little bit more differently.
Mm.
I know it's been suggested that the increased gas and dust created by the impact, rather than like heating and drying everything up following, the rain of molten glass, would actually turn the world into an impact winter.
Right.
So things would be cooler. The animals would be dying in sort of like a snowy, desolate landscape instead of a kind of dusty, droughty landscape as depicted here in the documentary. Um, but again, for the time, this was like a straightforward explanation of the Alvarez hypothesis, just put to stop motion,
Mhm.
and it's very haunting and very well done. And again, I commend the special effects for being so neat uh, in how they're depicting these events. Like one thing that I'm very curious to see how that was done was like some of the thunderstorms that are shown, because these are small sets that Tippett and the Tippett studio had made with the animals concerned. And so I think what they did was like they took like cotton and they made clouds, and then they would like shine little light bulbs behind the clouds, and that would depict like lightning. And then you just add the thunder sound effects, and it looks really cool. It's a really neat effect. Um, Now, of course, what's fun about this extinction event sequence is to compare this to the PBS 1992 documentary series. So just a few years later, there was another documentary series that was called The Dinosaurs! Exclamation point. It's a pretty popular name, I suppose. Um, which, I mean, we could spend a whole episode talking about. That's another fun documentary series to unpack, but we're not going to do that today. But I will say that that also featured a KPG extinction event sequence that was just a little bit different from how the Phil Tippett sequence did it, namely because they do feature the impact winter included. Of course, this is a couple years after impact winter studies were being done by like Carl Sagan and colleagues in response to like nuclear weapons. So the connection was made to a bolide impact probably having the exact same effect. So you have like dinosaurs like eking out for food in the snow. Again, you're having the large dinosaurs living a little bit longer than they probably should, but more or less the sequence of events is almost parallel to what we see here in Dinosaur. So I thought that was pretty neat. Just a little bit again, a little bit of paleo history in terms of mass extinction research. What do you think, buddy?
Yeah, it's definitely very interesting to see um, a depiction of the KPG extinction, especially by bolide impact at this point in time. Um, yeah, it also stood out to me too that the sequence is pretty vague about exactly how the bolide impact is killing off the dinosaurs. But I guess it was a pretty safe way to go at the time because they we didn't know as much about that particular event. Um, it is really interesting if this is indeed the um, the earliest animated depiction of the end Cretaceous mass extinction at by bolide impact, at least. Um, it's definitely not a bad depiction, even though there certainly would be some things we change today. Like you said, like the large dinosaurs, for example, almost certainly wouldn't have survived for as long as they showed here. Certainly not the ones that were in range to actually see the impact happen. Um, yeah, I'm thinking of other similarly early depictions. I know that Doraemon actually did one. In the 1987 movie, Nobita and the Knights on Dinosaurs, they depicted the end Cretaceous mass extinction caused by a bolide impact. In that one, they actually showed the bolide hitting ocean, basically. So surprisingly prescient in that regard. Um, but yeah, again, 87, so it's still a bit later than this one.
And with that said, we'll end now on the next slide with some of our kind of final thoughts and our memories with these shorts,
Hmm.
because um, we were not alive in 1985 to see Dinosaur, which is the public release of Prehistoric Beasts, as well as they had an edited version of that in the same documentary. So our introduction to this animation was actually in other paleo media.
Right.
So it seems that, in the pre-Jurassic Park world, following the release of, well, following the completion of the Tippett short films and Dinosaur, the stop motion footage of those animals was sort of like the go-to stock footage
Right.
of semi-realistic dinosaurs in a lot of different media. Um, Speaking for myself, my introduction to the Tippett animations was from the Eyewitness Dinosaur VHS. So, of course, Eyewitness, the famous educational book series, still being published today. Um, they had a television series back in the 90s that lasted about 3 seasons. And the first season had a dinosaur episode. And a lot of the stock footage that was used came from both Prehistoric Beast and Dinosaur,
Mhm.
albeit in an edited and redubbed fashion. I actually have memories of being terrified of
Yeah.
the Monoclonius Tyrannosaurus fight because in the original Prehistoric Beast short film, there's sort of like an 80s synth score that's attached to the music, and it gets a little bit cheery at times, but it's also kind of like dramatic as well.
Mm.
Here, they put no music. It's just this animal in the woods, and then the T Rex comes with completely different audio effects. By the way, like more terrifying yowls and screams, and like it was like, ooh, like I don't want to
Yeah.
be, I don't want to look at this.
Right.
Let's get to the next scene already. Um, so like this animation made an impact on me for years to come, and it's interesting to see that because like so they had a dinosaur episode and they had a prehistoric life episode. And because they did the dinosaur episode, they didn't put too many dinosaurs in the prehistoric one. So all they really had was a zoom in on a T Rex lower jaw, and then again recut footage of the prehistoric beast fight before moving on to the Quetzalcoatlus plane. Um, so they really liked using that sequence a lot. I know they featured the Brontosaurus a lot. There were some shots of the Hadrosaur and the Struthiomimus. For some reason, they did not decide to use the Deinonychus footage at all
Mm.
in Eyewitness Dinosaur. I didn't know that that existed until National Geographic's Really Wild Animals from the following year. So this was another series, educational series. Um, I don't think this premiered on TV. I think these were like VHSs that you had to buy.
Yeah, I think
Um,
so.
yeah, and it featured a little animated globe character called Spin, voiced by W. Moore, who I guess is a British comedian. And they had dinosaurs and other creature features. So this is kind of an odd mix. It was like a two-part episode
Yeah.
where the first half was spent on like dinosaurs and dinosaur paleontology, and then the second half featured, I guess, like kind of conventional creepy animals, snakes and spiders and bats and things like that. So I guess they were kind of playing on like the animals that are commonly featured in like horror thriller tropes, which dinosaurs would fit very well. Um, but I remember liking the dinosaur sequences a lot more. And yeah, they just straight up featured like the vast majority of the Phil Tippett sequences in that episode. I mean, they have the whole Hadrosaur herd family. They show the dinosaur fight. Um, they had some really fun songs that used clips from the
Yeah. Mm.
from the short films, which I could sing by heart right now if I wanted to, but I don't know if I do. Um, but yeah, so those were my introductions to the Phil Tippett sequences. Of course, it's not until later in the age of the internet that I was able to track down the production history and learn that, oh, these are from an earlier short film um, that wasn't really readily available.
Mhm.
Like before Tippett released the remastered, films, the best you could do was find, clips from Dinosaur, which was already on YouTube at the time, or you had clips from like Dinosaur CD-ROMs that also featured this footage, which of course meant it was very grainy quality, not like the beautifully remastered footage that you can get nowadays. Um, and so, Albert, I believe that you pretty much had almost the exact same introduction to these short films as I did.
Yeah, I would say I had pretty much the same experience from what to what you described. Now, I'm not entirely sure if I saw the eyewitness episode for sort of the Really Wild Animals episode first. I saw them close to around the same time, but it might have been similar. But yeah, in any case, I like even my reactions to to the films were pretty similar too. Like
Mhm.
you mentioned, like being terrified of the prehistoric beast scene, at least the way it was cut in Eyewitness. And yeah, I can relate to that. I was like legitimately terrified of it too. Like that. that was probably like one of the most legitimately scary things I'd ever seen as a kid. And like it was one of those things where it's like to the point where after I had finished watching the film, like, the entire episode of Eyewitness, I would still think back to that one scene
Mm.
and get chills about it because yeah, it was the way they did it. It was scary. I mean, the original film, as we discussed, was already shot in a very scary like horror film kind of vibe, but yeah, the way that they edited it made it like legitimately like nightmare feel, I guess. So yes, that definitely left a very strong, lasting impression. And yeah, the really wild animals sequences too, like where I saw the rest. Like those weren't as scary, but I definitely do remember them very well too, just for being like very lifelike depictions of dinosaurs for the time. Um, and also, I guess this was something we didn't really mention, was the scene where the adult hadrosaur like knocks over the T Rex because it's menacing its young. Like it
Right.
uses its tail to like knock it over. Like that was something I thought was pretty novel at the time, and it still is pretty novel now. They actually showed like hadrosaurs like physically defending themselves from carnivores and not just like as a harmless fodder, basically, which is sometimes the way they're depicted in pop culture. So that was pretty interesting. And certainly it is plausible. I mean, obviously, an animal that big is quite capable of like defending itself, even if it doesn't have like sharp teeth or sharp claws or anything like that. Just its size alone is a pretty potent weapon. So certainly something like that could have happened, and that certainly was a quite a very interesting choice of depiction for the time. Yeah, definitely my first exposure to these stop motion films were like these two particular educational series that I watched quite a lot of back in the day when I was a kid. They were definitely a formative part of my childhood. I think it's hard to understate because like we're in an era post Walking with Dinosaurs now, and so like Walking with Dinosaurs tends to be the go-to comparison for like lifelike depictions of prehistoric life in nature documentaries these days. But like back in the 90s, like pre 1999, it was like these particular sequences that showed up again and again in educational shows, and that left a very strong impression on people. And not only were reused, but also inspired other works too. And so that's kind of what the other two pictures that we have on this slide are meant to represent a number of works earlier in the 90s that seem to have at least taken cues or inspiration from Prehistoric Beast and or the other dinosaur stop motion that was used in Dinosaur. One of these in the top left is from a series also made by the BBC, another nature documentary called The Velvet Claw. And so this was a series that was primarily focused on the diversity and evolution of carnivorous mammals. So think things like cats and dogs and bears and weasels and their close relatives. So basically, most of the major carnivorous mammals that are alive today. And it's a really excellent series. Like, I mean, especially for its time, but like even now, there's a lot of it that holds up, and there's still a lot of it that I feel like modern documentaries could take some cues from. Like, yeah, The Velvet Claw, I would say, is potentially one of my favorite nature documentary series that I've ever seen. And maybe it could be one that we could review for another episode, but who knows? But anyways, that's
Mm.
beside the point. So in the very beginning of the series, like at the very beginning of the first episode, before they dive into the main subject matter of carnivorous mammals, they actually have a short animated sequence. And in fact, there were a lot of like these animated sequences throughout the series. This particular sequence was showing a pair of dromaeosaurids hunting an ornithomimid, very similar to what was depicted in Dinosaur. Now, according to the tie-in book to the Velvet Claw, which there was one, these are meant to be Deinonychus and ornithomimid, so not Struthiomimus, but in the way it's set up and the choreography of the hunt, like the way that they chase after the ornithomimid and eventually corner it, and it has a sort of like kind of last ditch attempt to defend itself before being taken down. The way that those shots are composed are very similar to how it was in Dinosaur. So I strongly suspect, even though I don't know for sure, that this sequence was done like inspired by that particular scene from Dinosaur. Um, and so the purpose of the scene in The Velvet Claw was to show that, oh, like previously, dinosaurs ruled the world, basically, and it was kind of interesting too that they emphasize that, yeah, dinosaurs were a very successful group, and they could be very fast and very intelligent, but eventually, they they were wiped out, or at least most of them were. This was before we were widely calling birds dinosaurs. Um, and then it was only after that that the mammals took over as the main apex predators, giving rise to the carnivorans among other groups. Um, and so, yeah, it was a very short sequence, but you can kind of see where they probably got some inspiration from. Um, and the other screenshot I have here is from Doraemon. Wow, I've been mentioning Doraemon a lot in this episode, but it happens to be relevant. And if you're not familiar with Doraemon, we've done a whole review of one of the movies from the franchise a while back. So you can go check that out for an intro to the franchise. But I guess as a very basic introduction to it, Doraemon is a Japanese franchise. It originated as a comic slash manga, and eventually was made into a couple of very successful anime series, one of which is still airing today. The premise of the franchise is that Doraemon is a robotic cat from the 22nd century who has traveled back in time to help a boy named Nobita, who is the main character of the franchise. And Doraemon has this pocket that holds like infinite hammer space, basically, where he keeps like a bunch of different like futuristic technologies and gadgets that he brought from the future. And so he uses these gadgets, to kind of comply with Nobita's requests or needs. Various shenanigans ensue from them. Now, this particular screenshot is from a Doraemon short film. So it was released in theaters, but it was like sort of like a bonus film to accompany the longer theatrical film that they released that year. So Doraemon has released films like almost every year since 1980. Um, and so this is a short film where Doraemon himself does not feature. And in fact, even if you're like a hardcore Doraemon fan, there is a possibility that you haven't seen this film before because it's like a bonus film and not like one of the mainline series films. But instead, it features Doraemon's sister, his little sister, who is also a robotic cat. And yeah, they're robots, but they can be siblings because they share the same motor oil. Apparently, that's the lore. Most of the time, like Doraemon's sister stays in the 22nd century, and she takes care of Nobita's descendants. The premise of this film is that she takes like Nobita's great great grandson and his friends into the past to look at dinosaurs, and they have all these various adventures featuring dinosaurs. It's quite an interesting film because, again, of the context of the time that was made, it was also like these post-Renaissance dinosaur depictions, and it would be interesting to do a review about that at some point too. But anyways, I guess what's relevant to our particular topic of this episode is that there is a scene in this short film that I again strongly suspect was based on Prehistoric Beast. There is almost no information about the production of Doraemon films, which is pretty annoying. So I do not know for sure if anybody has ever said this on record, but just the way that the sequence is framed and shot, I strongly suspect it was taking cues from Prehistoric Beast. So what the sequence is that it's a scene where that takes place at night, and you see this hadrosaur, probably based on Lambeosaurus, based on the crest shape, feeding on these flowers in the middle of these dark woods. And as it is feeding, you see a T-Rex kind of creeping up behind it, and you see like shots of like not the whole T-Rex, but like different parts of its body. So like its legs that's getting ready to pounce, and its head. And eventually, after kind of the setup work, as you see the T-Rex looming around in the background. Well, at least in the screenshot, it's in the foreground. Eventually, it cuts to a scene where it lunges, and you see the shocked kind of face on the hadrosaur. It cuts to like blood splattering on a nearby plant as the hadrosaur is presumably killed. And so it's not one to one, but just the way that the whole thing proceeds, and the way that the shots are set up, and the setting and the premise of this particular scene. I strongly suspect that the filmmakers had seen Prehistoric Beast and were basing like this on it as a homage. You can see like the potential influence of these Phil Tippett films like throughout like the paleo media of the 1990s. It's super interesting to see like what an effect that it had, and it left this legacy, even though like today, I suspect that paleo enthusiasts who grew up after Walking with Dinosaurs are more familiar with, Walking with Dinosaurs and the various like sequels and imitators that came after that. But there was a time where like Phil Tippett's stop motion dinosaur films were like the cutting edge of trying to depict these animals as like living organisms in like film, basically. Um, and not in a fictional context either, like in Jurassic Park, but as like a very naturalistic kind of depiction. And certainly, it is, I would say, well deserved because, as we have discussed, I think even today, a lot of the effects of those films still hold up very well, and even a lot of the science even still holds up very well. Like obviously, things have changed in the last 30 plus years, but it was already quite up to date for its time, and it came out at a time where our understanding of these animals was really starting to revolutionize. And so I think that has really worked out very well in its favor since it consulted those recent advances so heavily. Um, and yeah, it's been a really interesting experience to revisit these stop motion films.
Absolutely, I concur, and I think that that's a really great place to stop. And thank you all so much for joining us on this episode today. I find that I really enjoy doing um these sort of mixed episodes. We really had kind of a fun grab bag of things today, and certainly I encourage everyone to check out Prehistoric Beast and Dinosaur, and we will almost certainly be providing official links in the description for you to check out and support the Tippett Studio as well. Also linked to his official page as well, and the Dino Diego review as well, if you want some more of the technical behind the scenes look at these short films, because it's also as fascinating as well and includes some really fun interviews and production photos too, which I'm not going to spoil, but they're pretty humorous. Um, so with that, that is it for our show. Let's go ahead and move to the next slide, and we'll do our closing acknowledgments. So of course, we are on Patreon. That is patreon.com/Time and Clades. For those not in the know, Patreon is a website where users can provide monetary donations to content creators of any amount, and they are usually given access through their membership to exclusive behind the scenes content, early updates, maybe even early access to shows. And so if you're interested in supporting us, you'll get early notices of like what stories are going to cover. You might get the ability to send questions on topics related to said stories, and things like that. And of course, any contribution will help us continue this series and develop new projects and expansions. And I will say this, depending on what tier you choose, you are also owed shout outs. So at the end of each episode, we shout out a number of viewers who are on that specific tier. So we want to thank my sister Julie and our good friends Paul, Denver, Tristan, Frankish, and Valdenunzio for their contributions. We thank you very much for your donations, and we're always appreciative of every little amount. And so, moving on to our general acknowledgments, of course, we want to thank our good friends Henry and Alicia for their contributions to the series. Henry is responsible for the wonderful theme music that opens each episode. I also want to give a special thanks to Henry for helping me with research on paleo documentaries, because they were able to provide me with the notice of the Nova documentary to be more confident that Dinosaur was the first to depict the KBG, in a whole animated sequence. So many thanks to that, Henry. And of course, Alicia is responsible for the color scheme of Albert's Allosaur avatar, a cheery little fellow. Moving on from that, of course, we are still on Twitter. We are at Time and Clades, where we usually post episodes as they are completed. But most likely, you are watching us from our YouTube page through Time and Clade. So if you wish to like and subscribe, that's always appreciated. If you have any questions at all about the show, whether that be about the topics that we covered or just anything in general, there's three ways to contact us. You can email us, timeandclades@gmail.com. You can tweet at us, or you can leave a YouTube comment, and we will respond in kind. And as I mentioned before, you can go to the description for links, references for our news stories, as well as for any additional things that we talk about in this episode. And so that is that. I am very happy to announce, and I will do this actually right now. Um, Although if you've been following us on Patreon, you will probably already know. I have had a lot of good energy and time as of late, and I know it's been a little bit of a long stretch since we talked about Humanity: A Prologue Season 2. I am very happy to say that we are back in business and episode 2 has been completed. And so, as of the recording of this episode on the 23rd of August, 2024, we will have next week a recording session for episode 2. So, you're going to get 2 new episodes of Through Time and Clades here in a relatively short period of time. And this episode, of course, is going to be called Ancestry and featuring basically a dive through the tree of biological life to trace the acquisition of the traits of the human body as they emerged over the billions of years that life has been on this planet. It's to be a very fun and very engaging episode, and I can't wait to share it with you all. So we have that to look forward to, as well as other surprises that we are still keeping under wraps for the time being. But until then, we want to thank you all for joining us today, and we hope that you all have a wonderful week. Take care.
Indeed. Have a good one, everybody.